want to continue that bipartisan work today. And I look forward to working with my colleagues, both Democrat and Republican, on extending this important program to promote environmental cleanup and economic redevelopment across our country. Our hearing today is timely because the Brownfields program formally expires this year. Importantly, today's hearing also reaffirms the committee's jurisdiction over the program and advances the reauthorization process through regular order. I, again, appreciate our witnesses for joining us today to shed light on how EPA's Brownfields program is currently working, identify opportunities for improvement, and find ways to monitor the progress of grant-funded projects, particularly since the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided an unprecedented infusion of funding to the EPA for Brownfields. The Brownfields program provides critical grant funding and liability protections that allow states, communities, and stakeholders to clean up and redevelop previously contaminated sites. I'm proud to have represented Eastern and Southeastern Ohio with its rich history of manufacturing and industrial development. And I've seen the significant benefits of Brownfields investments in and around my own district. For example, I mentioned this in our last Brownfields hearing. The district lines have changed since 2020, but in May of 2020, under the Trump administration, the EPA awarded $600,000 in Brownfields program funding to clean up former industrial sites in Ironton and Coal Grove in southern Ohio. This was and continues to be a big deal for these rural Appalachian communities with a proud history of manufacturing and industry along the Ohio River. But also looking to Northeast Ohio. I was proud just a couple of years ago to speak with local leaders and tour the WIC 6 Brownfield site in Youngstown, which also received a substantial grant from the EPA. My friends, the point is that many of you on this subcommittee today have probably seen similar successes of these Brownfield grants in your district. So I believe we can build on recent successes of the Brownfields program so communities all across America can benefit from the EPA's dual environmental and economic investment. So the discussion draft we're focusing on today includes 5 legislative tweaks to strengthen the Brownfields program. First, the draft creates the Rural Brownfields Showcase Program with grants for communities with populations less than 50,000 residents and less than 100,000 residents, 2 different tiers. I represent several rural counties, as do many of our subcommittee members, and we strongly believe that the Rural Brownfield Showcase Program would ensure that these communities, rural communities, are not left behind. In addition, oversight of brownfields is incredibly important, and the discussion draft outlines unique roles for the EPA and EPA's Office of Inspector General to conduct internal audits to ensure that federal funds are awarded properly. Simply increasing overall funding levels for brownfields without carefully crafted oversight mechanisms could lead to lower quality projects, not to mention waste, fraud, and abuse. The draft also increases the involvement of local governing officials by adding local concurrence as a condition of EPA awards. Furthermore, the discussion draft also the discussion draft allows private for-profit limited liability partnerships whose application has the backing of the local government, a state-sanctioned redevelopment agency, or a nonprofit in order to receive grants under the Brownfields program. If we're looking to stretch federal dollars to the fullest, we should include these relevant stakeholders in the process. Finally, the draft authorizes appropriations for 5 years through fiscal year 2028, providing the necessary certainty to the program to encourage more investment and economic development. Of note, authorization amounts in the discussion draft are intentionally blank. I have some concerns with permanently increasing grant amounts and waiving cost-sharing requirements, but I hope that today's conversation and future conversations will allow us to reach consensus. In summary, I look forward to working with my Republican and Democratic colleagues, the EPA, state and local officials, and private sector stakeholders to help ensure that the Brownfields program continues to bolster communities by funding environmental cleanup and economic redevelopment across the country. And with that, thank you for indulging my time, and I yield back. And now I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing on the majority's discussion draft to reauthorize EPA's Brownfields program. Whenever we discuss this program, I immediately think about the opportunities that have been created in my home district and my hometown from the remediation of former industrial sites. Along the Mohawk and Hudson Rivers, many mill towns once thrived. Factories produced carpets and collars and leather products. But when those factories closed, valuable properties, often on the waterfront, were left abandoned or underutilized. Thanks to the hard work of local governments, often with the support of EPA funding, many of these properties have been able to be transformed. In some places, new parks allowing public access to the waterfront have been created. In other sites have been prepared for economic redevelopment, enabling a new employer to move into that given space. This is a common good news story, and it is not unique to my district. Brownfields are found in communities all across our country, from the most industrial cities to the most rural of towns. And these success stories would not be possible without the EPA. Because of EPA's support since 2002, tens of thousands of acres of idle land have been made ready for productive use, increasing nearby property values and helping to preserve greenfields. These properties have been brought back onto the tax rolls and have helped support communities' revitalization efforts. And they have protected public health by addressing potential environmental threats. I am so proud of the bipartisan work the subcommittee did during the last reauthorization to strengthen this program. That effort made a number of widely agreed upon improvements based on the consensus recommendations from a range of stakeholders. This included increasing individual grants to enable more complex sites to be remediated, creating multi-purpose grants, making it possible for nonprofit stakeholders to get more involved in the program, and allowing a small portion of grants to be used to cover administrative costs. With these reforms, the program has continued its strong track record of success. Each federal dollar spent continues to leverage about $20. And just yesterday, EPA announced the availability of some $235 million in multi-purpose assessment and cleanup grants made possible by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is making a difference all across our country. The bipartisan infrastructure law included an historic investment of $1.5 billion for the program, and these funds provide even greater opportunities for disadvantaged communities by removing the program's cost-share requirements. I'm very excited about so much of the work that we can do. I have no doubt that this round of funding will bring new opportunities and hope to many communities. I'm thankful that the work of the program since the last reauthorization has moved us even further. I believe the changes that were made have been successful, and I'm eager to examine how we can build upon that success. But with that said, there are a few provisions in the discussion draft under consideration today that I'm not convinced have the same level of consensus and widespread support as the reforms from 2018. I also want to note that the authorization funding levels have been left blank. I expect one area where we will hear agreement from all the stakeholders today is that this very successful program can and should receive more funding. We know the Brownfields program is an incredible investment of federal dollars. It enables local governments to support environmental and economic revitalization by turning a liability into an opportunity. So I truly hope that we can work together to make certain this program has the resources and authorities necessary to continue assessing and remediating the tremendous number of remaining sites across our country. I look forward to hearing from our witness, and I hope we can work together on this legislation. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Today, we are examining the EPA's Brownfields program. This program was authorized under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. It's commonly referred to as either CERCLA or Superfund. A brownfield site, as many of you know, is an abandoned or underutilized property with known or suspected contamination. The risk of legal liability for existing contamination can discourage interested buyers from purchasing the property for redevelopment due to threats of litigation. This can rob communities of vital economic development opportunities. The Brownfields statute provides liability defenses for landlords and potential purchasers and authorizes grants to encourage environmental assessment cleanups. This program can rejuvenate existing property and infrastructure and take development pressures off of undeveloped land. And it improves the environment. All of this increases local tax bases and creates jobs for Americans across the country. The Brownfields program has been successful in removing barriers to investment and economic development while also addressing environmental contamination. Since 2002, the EPA's Brownfields program has cleaned up 2,260 properties, revitalized 10,400 properties for reuse, created more than 270,000 jobs, and resulted in nearly $40 billion in investment. This is translated into numerous success stories. There's Minute Maid Park in Houston, Texas, home of the Houston Asteroids. Since 2000, the ballpark holds more than 41,000 fans for its 81 home games each season. Minute Maid Park has hosted games in 3 of the last 7 World Series, including in 2021, when the 3 World Series games generated more than $25 million for Houston. The park also frequently hosts concerts and other major events to bring the Houston community together. And then there's the Georgia Sea Turtle Center at Jekyll Island, Georgia. This 5,500 square foot facility includes an exhibit area, visitor space, and a veterinary clinic. Jekyll Island, where the turtle cancer is located, receives more than 3 million visitors per year. And looking closer to my home, there's the University District in Spokane, Washington. The University District has 5 major universities and 2 medical school programs. The Health Education and Research Complex at the University District boasts some 90,000 enrolled students at 8 regional universities. The University District also inspires economic development, such as Life Sciences Spokane, which supports the billion-dollar Intermountain Northwest Health Sciences sector. The Brownfields program has played a role in all these stories, improving the lives of Americans and bringing prosperity around the country. By reauthorizing the Brownfields program, we can build on these successes. Brownfields extension has historically been a bipartisan goal for the committee. And as the authorizing committee, one of our most important responsibilities are these regular reauthorizations, which help ensure taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly and that programs like Brownfields are working and helping our communities. Today's hearing is an opportunity to review and if possible, enhance the Brownfields program. It's a continuation of the regular order process that began last Congress. This discussion draft is the next step. And as always, we encourage engagement from all members and stakeholders as we work through the committee process and especially when considering the funding figures for the program. And it's important that we don't neglect to remember just how much in taxpayer dollars was spent last Congress. It is vital that we appropriate responsibly and allow for proper oversight to ensure accountability of these resources. There are risks to dramatically increasing funding, including decreasing competition as well as quality among grant applicants. We also need to make sure non-suburban communities or those with less than 100,000 people are benefiting from the program. We should continue the tradition of bipartisan action on this subject. The Brownfields program continues to be an effective cleanup program with a purpose, encouraging economic growth and improving communities in places that have lacked investment. Let's stay focused on the goal, which has brought prosperity, revitalization, and opportunity to communities across the country. I welcome the witnesses today, Mr. Breen, and those that will be following their perspectives and look forward to their testimony. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're discussing the EPA's Brownfields program and the majority's discussion draft to update and reauthorize the program through fiscal year 2028. The Brownfields program is a shining example of how government can both stimulate economic growth and protect public health in local communities. In 2002, I partnered with the late Representative Paul Gilmore of Ohio, who chaired this subcommittee at the time, to write the Brownfields law. And since then, the Brownfields program has consistently enjoyed bipartisan support, including the historic funding boost that was passed as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law last Congress. Over the last 20 years, the Brownfields program has been an economic engine for local government and communities looking to turn former contaminated sites into economic centers and green spaces. As part of this program, the federal government provides financial help in the form of loans or grants for cleanup, assessments, and job training so communities can turn dilapidated sites into parks, public housing, or new business centers. And by revitalizing these properties, communities are growing their economies for the future and creating good-paying jobs. And I just want to reiterate that for every dollar we invest in the Brownfields program, we get $20 back in economic return. And since the inception of the program, 37,000 sites and 163,000 acres have been revitalized and made ready for development around the country. Not only does the program clean up formerly contaminated sites and boost economic development, but it also benefits public health and safety by reducing contamination in communities that couldn't afford to repurpose the site on their own. Now, the bipartisan infrastructure law passed through Congress and signed by the President 2 years ago injected $1.5 billion in the Brownfields program. This historic investment also eliminated cost-share requirements for applicants and increased the grant amounts. Since that time, the EPA has awarded $215 million in grants to 262 communities around the country. And that's just the beginning. We funded the Brownfields program through the fiscal year 2026 in the bipartisan infrastructure law, so we will need to reauthorize and fund the program again in the near future. And that's why today's hearing is so important. I believe that starting these bipartisan conversations early is a necessary first step. I hope we can all agree that this program is more than worth every dollar we put into it, and that we can work together to maintain robust funding moving forward. Now, the Republicans have put forward a discussion draft to reauthorize the program. I have reservations about some of the provisions included in the draft, particularly the provision that would, for the first time, allow private companies to access the limited public funds for this program. The Brownfields program was never intended to provide cleanup and revitalization funding for for-profit organizations, and I don't believe that it should start doing that now. Nevertheless, I look forward to working with my colleagues so that we can continue the bipartisan tradition and ensure that any final reauthorization legislation benefits the communities it's meant to serve. I'm also pleased to see the EPA Deputy Assistant Administrator, Barry Breen, here today. Having EPA's direct input on the legislation will be invaluable as we move forward. And I'd like to welcome the local leaders and stakeholders joining us on the second panel. I especially want to thank Mayor Bollwage from Elizabeth, New Jersey, for being here today. He has a long history of advocating for brownfields and testifying before the committee in support of the program. Finally, Mr. Chairman, it's important to recognize that all the great work being done at EPA on the Brownfields program would be jeopardized if House Republicans caved to the extreme elements in their party and forced a government shutdown. Program officers could not distribute grant money, cleanups could not be completed, and communities would be stuck in a state of limbo, waiting for the Republican House to figure out how to function and to govern. Across the country, communities are waiting for critical brownfields funding to break ground on their transformational projects, and I think we owe it to all of them to figure out a path forward. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back almost a full minute. Thank you, Mr. Pallone. Our first witness today is Mr. Barry Breen, the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Breen, welcome. Thank you for coming down today. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, and good morning, Chair Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, Chair Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone. Thank you for this opportunity to appear today to discuss revitalization of our communities through the reauthorization of EPA's Brownfields program. We appreciate the leadership that this subcommittee has shown over the years by helping us to establish the Brownfields program into law, and thank you for your continuing leadership in ongoing support over the many years that we have pursued the mission. We're looking forward to discussing with you today ways
Mr. Breen,
to
do you
further...
mind moving your mic a little closer?
Yes, thank you. How's that? Better? Thanks, Ms. Chet. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to discussing with you ways to further strengthen EPA's Brownfields program and the way we do our work in communities to enhance and advance contaminated land cleanups, environmental workforce development, and to provide a more resilient landscape for the American people. Our land programs work with states, tribes, local governments, and other federal agencies to provide positive outcomes. And our emergency response efforts under the Superfund program are a great example of multi-level agency collaboration. On that note, Mr. Chair, to you and to all, we wanted to take a moment to let you know that EPA continues to stand with you and with our federal, state, and local partners as we work together to support the community impacted by the tragic train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. Since its inception, EPA's Brownfields program has provided support directly to grant applicants, including rural and small communities that may be disproportionately impacted by legacy contamination. Our data indicates that approximately 160 million people, roughly 48% of the U.S. population, live within 3 miles of a brownfield site that has received EPA funding. We appreciate the importance and the attention that you're providing, and we recognize the challenge that many small and rural communities face that have not yet received funding, and we support providing further technical assistance to communities. We foster a community-driven approach, and as you mentioned, we have contributed to more than 10,500 properties being ready for productive use. We've leveraged over 260,000 jobs. We've increased tax revenue for local governments. We do this through partnerships with all of them. Importantly, we have a proven record of supporting small and rural communities. We frequently provide the seed money that encourages land use and attracts additional investment. However, we have concerns regarding the administrability of a program that would require local government concurrence of grant awards. This would be a significant departure from how we have successfully implemented the Brownfields program for more than 20 years. We provide input for state, tribal, and local governments through an intergovernmental review process, and we'd be happy to help you understand that better if you'd like. We appreciate the committee's support for the Brownfields program and the benefit it provides to communities around the country. Brownfields grants empower communities to address the environmental and social issues impacted by contaminated land. Thank you for your time today, and we're looking forward to helping.
The gentleman yields back, and thank you, Mr. Breen. And we will begin the questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes to start that. Mr. Breen, the discussion draft includes a rural brownfields showcase program to provide tools for smaller non-suburban communities to take advantage of EPA's Brownfields program. Is it important in your view to ensure that rural communities have access to Brownfields program resources?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Would technical assistance benefit communities under this program, those with less than 50,000 residents or less than 100,000 residents? Do you think technical assistance would benefit those communities?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. You know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funds come with huge increases in grant amounts, and it waives the matching requirements for certain types of grants. With so much funding right now, is there competition for that funding among applicants?
Yes, and I can help you with some statistics if you'd like.
Okay, quickly, yeah.
Okay, so we are, in our current technical assistance, trying to reach out especially to small, rural, and disadvantaged communities. So here are the statistics. Over the last 5 years, so this is before the Infrastructure Act and after, over the last 5 years, the success rate for all applicants is 33%. That is, 1/3 of the applicants are awarded. And in fact, that number's been true for about 10 years. That's a pretty steady state pre-infrastructure law. During that time, the success rate for those with less than 50,000 population was 34%. So 33% for the universe of applicants as a whole, 34% for those that were of less than 50,000 population. But in FY23, looking now that we've got infrastructure money and the additional technical assistance, everybody's success rate went up, and the numbers tell the following. The success rate for communities with a population over 50,000 has been 53%, so from 33 up to 53. The success rate for communities with a population under 50,000 is 57%, so up even more. And when you look for the smallest communities, the selection rate for communities with a population of less than 10,000 is 62%. So 33% before, up to in the 50s.
Okay.
53 for over 50,000, 57 for 10 to 50,000, and 62% for under 10,000.
Okay, all right. Well, I have a few more questions, so let me move. Thank you for those statistics. Could dramatically increasing funding be a disincentive for applicants to carefully draft proposals for long-term success if they know their project would be funded regardless?
It's hard to know. We've never been in that situation.
Okay. Are certain types of brownfields applicants not eligible to obtain IIJA funding because of the nature of those grants?
I don't think, I'd have to
Can you
ask you
get
to say
back
a little
to
more
us?
about what you're thinking of. I'm not thinking that the grant criteria have changed.
Okay, if there are eligibility barriers or requirements, would you get back to us on that?
We'd be happy to.
Are there issues right now between EPA's operation of traditional brownfields program grants and loans subject to regular appropriations while simultaneously managing the significant cash infusion and unique requirements for brownfields under the IIJA?
My understanding is we're using the same grant criteria.
Okay. What challenges does the EPA face with keeping the two pots of money separate? The traditional funding, the annual funding versus the IIJA funding?
I haven't heard of any challenges in that regard. We're pretty faithful to managing the appropriations.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Breen. With that, I'll yield back a whole 18 seconds. And now, Mr. Tonko, ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Breen, for once again appearing before our subcommittee. I'm grateful for your work and the work at the EPA, the staff that administers this program so effectively. But of course, we can always look for ways to improve the program. So, Mr. Breen, can you discuss any challenges EPA may face in administering the program? For example, do you have all the EPA personnel necessary to maximize the effectiveness of the program, and whatever other thoughts you have?
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. I sure appreciate it. Right now, with the staff that we have on board, we are making it work. We have about 1,100 open EPA cooperative agreements, and with the regional staff, we're covering it. But as the infrastructure money gets obligated more and more, that is, grants get awarded more and more, the number of projects will go up and up and up. So we have 1,100 projects right now. We're anticipating 2,700 open cooperative agreements in just a few years. The President's budget does call for sufficient funding to address that with increased hiring, and so we'd ask you to support the President's budget in that regard.
Thank you. And with the discussion draft, we would require EPA and the IG to conduct regular audits of the program. So, Mr. Breen, what safeguards are already in place for the agency to guard against waste or fraud or abuse within the grant program?
Thank you. So we have a number of safeguards in place. Of course, the Inspector General is already in place, and a healthy oversight from the Inspector General is an important part of all our programs, this one and others. We also run a very methodical grant selection in which panels are impaneled and review, and then points are awarded. Ultimately, those with the highest points get the award. We feel we do a very businesslike and objective job. It's hard, but remarkably, I don't think we've had much complaint about the objectivity of our work.
Thank you. And would you say there is a good track record of grantees making good on their commitments to the agency and using federal funds appropriately and effectively?
Yes, I think so.
The bill would automatically direct programmatic funding to the Inspector General. I certainly support more funding for the IG, but I'm not sure that taking funding out of the program office, which can be used to hire personnel, better administer the funds, and protect against waste before the IG is needed to be called upon, is the right approach. And Mr. Breen, I won't ask you to comment on this, but I feel compelled to remind everyone that a government shutdown would indeed hurt this program. And the funding cuts proposed in the House's Interior Appropriations Bill will certainly hurt this program. And that means local and state governments that rely on these funds to support their economic development agendas will feel that pain directly. These governments are trying to do the right thing, clean up their communities and get land back into productive use. But it will be difficult to do without EPA support. So rather than cutting EPA's budget and staff, we should be providing more federal support. And with that, Mr. Chair, I thank you and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Breen, for being here. As you know, this is extremely important. I'm glad to see that we're having this hearing, and I want to thank the chairman for this because this is very important. We know that we got thousands of brownfields across this country. I believe maybe 450,000 to be quite honest with you. But you know, my colleague, the chair of the full committee, Chairman Rogers, mentioned the Georgia Sea Turtle Center on Jekyll Island. That's in my district, and I'm very proud of that. I've got quite a few success stories of brownfields in my district, and that's one of them, where it used to be a coal-fire power plant, and now it's a center for rehabilitating sea turtles and research and educating the public, and that's in the southern portion of my district. In the northern portion of my district, in the Savannah area, one of our great corporate citizens, Reed Delaney, Delaney Industries, has completed the largest by-area brownfield cleanup in Georgia history. A great project, and again, a great corporate citizen who cares about our community, and we thank him for that. This facility was used for processing titanium dioxide, but now it's a new industrial terminal with a focus on sustainability, and I can't think of any better examples than these two right here in my own home district. So I'm very proud of that. But approvals and assessments and cleanups, they take so long. I've got 4 brownfields down in Glenn County that we have just been working on for years and years and years, and just so frustrated that we can't get anything done in these areas. And some of them are in great locations that would benefit the community enormously if we could get something done. And a lot of times they're opposed by various groups. But I want to ask you, because I'm building up to the point that, you know, do you think it's a wise use of federal tax dollars to award projects to communities where the local elected officials are not on board with the project?
Thank you, Mr. Carter. We sure appreciate the question. So we do work hard to work carefully with local governments. And with your agreement, I'd like to explain to you what we're doing currently, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
So,
Quickly, please.
So we saw that in the discussion draft, and we'd like to understand better any experiences where local governments have been displeased. The reason for that is we already have an intergovernmental review process to provide local governments an opportunity to submit their comments to EPA when applications for brownfields grants are selected for possible funding. That intergovernmental review process is codified in regulations, 40 CFR 29, and it's the same one used by programs throughout EPA. So,
Does it work?
well, I'll finish if I may, sir.
Okay.
So the EPA Brownfields program uses the same intergovernmental review process that other programs in the agency use. I can get you a list of all the
Okay,
programs
okay.
that use it. But the reason I wanted to let you know that is it gives states an option. States could choose to have a single point of contact, or a state could choose not. And where a state has chosen to have a single point of contact, then we'll work through that point of contact. Otherwise, we'll go out and make sure we direct that,
Okay.
that local governments get told. So if there are examples of local governments displeased with our work, we'd like to work with you on it.
Okay, well, the point I'm trying to make is that communication is the key, and that we've got to work with the local governments. If they don't buy in, it does no good whatsoever. And I get so frustrated with, and with all due respect, with the agencies pointing to a code somewhere saying we have to do it this way. You know, a lot of this is subjective, and we've just got to work with the local governments. The more they want this to work, the more we're going to be able to make it work. So that's what's so vitally important. Whenever the EPA, whenever local officials want a project to move forward, what kind of steps does EPA take to verify that that's going to happen?
Right. So what we do is, of course, we will take enormously seriously whatever comments we get from local governments. There is an interesting concept in the discussion draft that we'd want to make sure you thought hard about. The way it's written, if a state applied for a Brownfields grant, the state, we would have to go and ask the local government if they agreed with what the state had proposed. And that may raise issues under state law. So this seems like an area where technical assistance and working together might be helpful.
Okay. Just want to, again, stress how important it is to have buy-in from the local level. Two great examples in my district right there of where it has worked. It can work, and we owe it to the people to make it work. So thank you very much for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. We all love brownfields on a bipartisan level in this committee because it works so well to clean up contaminated properties in our districts and our states. My staff just gave me some information about Colorado's brownfields program without realizing that I had actually written the bill when I was in the state legislature in 1993, the Voluntary Redevelopment and Cleanup Act. And what she told me is, under that law, which has been in effect since 1994, we've had 1,558 approved voluntary cleanup plans and redevelopment programs in Colorado, which have restored 17,000 acres of land, constructed more than 50,000 new residences, and created 45,000 new jobs. So I feel pretty happy about that this morning. And I also feel happy that you are here today, Mr. Breen, because we can take that and we can apply it, and we are applying it all across the country. So I just want to ask you a couple questions about that. The IIJA appropriated $1.5 billion in additional funding through fiscal year 2026 for the Brownfields program. Is that right?
Yes, thank you.
And some of the funds are being used for environmental justice areas that are economically depressed. And so I'm just wondering if you can help talk to us about how the additional funds and the grant amounts allowed under IIJA can help expand the program to traditionally underserved areas.
Thank you. It is a wonderful tool in that regard. And in fact, there are a number of grant types that can be useful. One that I'd want to make sure you knew about is the Environmental Workforce Training Grant. There is an enormous good work being done. In fact, in your state, Ms. DeGette, the Colorado Department of Local Affairs was awarded a $200,000 Brownfields Environmental Workforce Development Job Training Grant. Even though COVID came in between, the grant recipient was able to overcome the COVID challenges. And earlier this year, 41 trainees are now employed thanks to the training they received in the program. There's so much good.
I think some of them actually are in some of the economically depressed areas of my district. So thank you very much. because of the funds in the IIJA, EPA anticipates that there's going to be an increase in the number of grants being managed by staff. Is that right?
Yes.
And how will the increase in grants impact staffing at the agency at EPA?
Yes, thank you. So right now, we're okay. You know, we're managing, although there's no time to spare, but we're managing. So there are 1,100 open cooperative agreements at the moment. And there is some additional staff provided by the IIJA, but it will disappear, of course, yet when the IIJA money is obligated, and yet those grants will still be open and need to be managed. And this is a little bit making sure taxpayers get their money's worth, and a lot making sure communities get their results. And so as we go from 1,100 open cooperative agreements to 2,700, we want to make sure those 2,700 communities are actually getting EPA staff expertise and not just a voice on the end of the phone.
Well, that's exactly right. That's how the grants are going to work. So I would hope you and your agency would continue to work with us. I'm glad you've got the staffing you need right now, because I don't think you're probably going to get any more staffing in the next couple of months, if I had to predict. But as it looks like you're getting short and you're needing more, please come back to us so we can work on a bipartisan way to make sure these grants are appropriately dispersed and managed.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And first, I want to thank Chair Johnson for holding today's hearing on a program that is important to both of our states. In my home state of Pennsylvania, we have many legacy industries, the coal, the steel, and railroad that were mined and forged in our cities and our towns. Sadly, many of these legacy industries have fallen on harder times. They've gone out of business, leaving behind land in need of environmental cleanup and communities with limited resources to invest in that needed redevelopment. This is where EPA's Brownfields programs has been useful to ensure that areas are not left behind and economic development and redevelopment can occur. Across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in places like Johnstown and Altoona, communities have used brownfields to leverage public and private funding to create family-sustaining jobs and businesses. This program is a great example of how, instead of federal government getting in the way with burdensome regulations, how it can work with local stakeholders to spur lasting redevelopment. Pennsylvania has been at the forefront of this effort, with both Republican and Democrat governors deploying state funding and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to help bring grants back to the Commonwealth. It is an important program that should be reauthorized and a model that demonstrates that when the federal government stops attacking businesses and instead works with them, we can help our constituents revitalize our nation. Deputy Assistant Administrator Breen, we see the value in land revitalization from a health and an environmental standpoint. But as I touched on, the program is particularly useful as a tool to spur economic development. Do you agree that land revitalization can grow the economies of rural communities?
Yes, thank you.
Will you commit to refocus your efforts and attention on growing rural communities and their economies through land revitalization?
Thank you. We're actually doing an enormous amount of technical assistance as we are managing the program right now. We'd like to meet with your staff if you'd like to hear more.
I would certainly welcome that meeting as well and bring in those communities that are affected. We will look forward to scheduling that with you. Administrator Breen, your agency's website promotes its land revitalization program, which includes the brownfield programs. In practical terms, what is the difference between the sustainable development of abandoned properties and something that wouldn't qualify?
I want to make sure I understand your question. Something that would not qualify for the Brownfields program?
Do they have to be abandoned properties to make that qualification?
You know, we'd better get the lawyers to help on that. I don't think I could accurately get the words just right and be be sure to get you the
We
answer.
will
Let me
follow
get
up
back
with
to you
that,
on
with your agency specifically.
Okay.
When the EPA makes the claim about land revitalization programs and promote the integration, and again, I'm quoting, sustainable reuse considerations into all cleanup and redevelopment decisions, where in either Section 104K or 128 is this criteria imposed on the agency?
I think I understand the question. The grant criteria?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned, I'll get my statute. The criteria are in 104.
And 128.
Oh, 128. I thought
104 or 128, they're both delineated there.
Okay, thanks. 104K.
Yes, sir.
6C.
Yes, sir.
So I hope that helps.
I think it should.
Okay.
Are these criteria used or used more heavily than others when award funding, and shouldn't the continued economic benefit to local areas be an important, if not the most important criteria?
Thank you. So I'll just, if you don't mind, may I tell you where the grant criteria address that as
Yes,
it's
sir.
currently written in the statute? I mentioned
104.
104K 6C. Here's the statute's terms. The extent to which a grant would meet the needs of a community that has a small population or a low income, and the extent to which the grant would further fair distribution of funding between urban and non-urban areas. So those are already in the criteria.
And I think that the emphasis, particularly as someone who represents predominantly a rural area, that equitable distribution into rural areas, we look forward to working with you, bringing all the stakeholders to the table and making sure that that equitable distribution into rural areas is maintained. I thank you for offering to have that meeting, and I look forward to following up. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Representative Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Breen. As you know, brownfield sites are a problem we face in every single state, in every district across the country, contaminated by pollutants or hazardous materials that were not properly remediated in the past. These are properties that are a current threat to the health and well-being of nearby communities and rob those same communities of the future opportunity to use these spaces in a very beneficial way. By providing technical assistance and grants to fund planning, assessment, and cleanup of these contaminated properties in communities that would otherwise be unable to take on the cleanup, the Brownfields program facilitates site remediation that spurs economic redevelopment. And by making these areas available for productive purposes, as I understand it, the Brownfields program produces a $20 return on investment for every $1 spent, which is really a tremendous figure. The Brownfields program is one of the best examples of how we can simultaneously protect human health and the environment on the one hand and foster long-term economic development and job creation on the other hand. Since 2018, EPA brownfields activities have been authorized, as you know, at $200 million a year. Can you give me a sense at this funding level how many applicants to the program were denied brownfields grants just because of lack of funding?
Yes. At least I can get a start on it. So before the infrastructure law, we were able to fund about a third, 33 to 34% of applicants were funded.
Okay.
Now those numbers are up into the half to two-thirds range, depending on the size of the community.
Great.
But it still means there are quite a few that are not funded.
I'm proud that you've mentioned it now that for fiscal years 2022 through 2026, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which you just referenced, grants an additional $300 million a year to the EPA's brownfields activities, funding that can now be allocated to larger grants, and I guess a larger number of grants, and to make cleanup more accessible to the most underserved communities. I'm also of the understanding that there's not a cost share requirement in there, which is important. How have these additional funds changed the kinds of activities or applicants that can be successfully funded through the Brownfields program? I assume that having more resources gives you a broader scope and being able to be responsive to different kinds of applications that are coming at you?
We are working hard to make sure that small and rural and disadvantaged communities know how to apply, and we're providing technical assistance in that regard. We think the results are promising, and we'd like to continue them.
It'll be interesting for us in this committee to get some report on that in the future at the appropriate time when you think the various dimensions have been sort of at least explored on an initial basis. Despite the successful expansion of the Brownfields program, of course, many communities are still waiting for assistance to begin remediating their sites and revitalizing their communities. For example, while my district had several Brownfield success stories when it encompassed parts of Baltimore, my newly redrawn district hasn't received any funding in the last several years, despite having nearly 200 active Brownfield sites. So you can see why I'm particularly interested in the expansion of the scope and more resources being brought to bear. I think you alluded to it, but even now with the enactment of the infrastructure bill and the additional funding, tell me again how many applicants to the Brownfields program are still being turned away just because the funding isn't at the highest level it could be?
Yes. And can I just add, I grew up just outside of your district. I could have ridden my bike into your district.
All right, well, keep riding your bike in there.
In the newest round, for municipalities over 50,000, the success rate is, I think, 52%.
Okay.
For municipalities between 10 and 50,000, it's a 57% success rate. And for the very smallest, under 10,000, a 62% success rate.
Okay.
I'd like to get you those numbers for the record so I can be completely unsure of them.
Well, as I'm closing, let me just observe, as others done, the successful program, we all view it as a successful. It's oversubscribed, even with historic funding. So as we consider reauthorizing it, it's essential that we make sure these important resources are there to help revitalize more communities for years to come. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the chair of the entire Energy and Commerce Committee, Chair Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Breen, recently in speaking with the Inspector General for the Environmental Protection Agency, he told me that the agency rarely conducts internal audits of its work. So I wanted to ask, does the Office of Land and Emergency Management conduct internal audits of the Brownfields program?
I can't point to something that I would say is labeled as an audit. We have the IG who does audits and reviews and evaluations. We have our own evaluation function, but I can't point to something that I would say we label as an audit apart from the IG.
Why not?
We'd want to make sure we spent the dollars you give us carefully. We haven't found a lot of red flags pointing toward trouble.
How often does the IG examine the Brownfields program's books and operations?
I should let the IG get back to you on that. I don't have that number.
So I understand that under CERCLA, section 104K8, the Inspector General is not tied to a regular interval at which these inspections are supposed to occur. Is that your understanding?
I'd have to look it up, Your Honor.
Okay.
I don't know.
If EPA were to have received full funding at the current authorized levels in CERCLA, sections 104K and 128, in addition to the advanced appropriations under the IIJA, the Brownfields program would receive $550 million in a fiscal year, so $440 million and $110 million respectively. So practically speaking, what would be the management and maintenance challenges presented by growing the program's budget by more than 150%?
Right. I think the biggest challenge is making sure we have the staff on hand, and it's not in Washington, D.C. I believe it's true. We're not asking for any more staff in Washington, D.C. It's in the regional offices that the additional staffing would be provided under the president's budget. And they would be there for communities and also to make sure that the money is faithfully spent.
What do you think about separating the IIJA funds and its one-time waivers with CERCLA funding?
I'm
What do you
sorry.
think about separating the IIJA funds and its one-time waivers with CERCLA funds?
Could I think I understand the question. Is it appropriate, how appropriate is it to keep the two funding streams separate?
Right, rather than incorporating it into,
Okay.
incorporating it into the baseline, basically.
Let us get back to you on that for the record. I don't have a good sense of that.
Do you have insights into what you believe the impact would be in making these levels permanent?
Yes, we've had good experience with the infrastructure money in terms of not having to say no to applicants that are deserving. We've been able to fund more
Okay.
applicants.
Thank you. If you permanently waive matching requirements for Brownfields revolving loan funds, would those funds have more difficulty revolving?
If we permanently waived matching requirements, I don't know that we have that experience, so I don't have a sort of a track record to point you to, and I wonder if I could get you some better opinions on that.
Okay, because that's one of the provisions in IIJA.
Okay,
So,
I'll need to get back to you
okay,
on that.
okay. Are there any program or legal conflicts for the Brownfields program created by IIJA that you need Congress to help and untangle?
Thank you. No, we don't have anything that we're here to ask you to follow up on today.
Okay, well, I would ask you to follow up on this question around the waiving of the matching requirements that was included in IIJA, and also the issues around internal audits.
Thank you.
Because I was personally just shocked to learn that we don't have, and EPA doesn't have internal audits. That seems pretty basic when you're handling billions of dollars, and it's billions of dollars, and the baseline budget for EPA is about $10 billion a year, and now with the infrastructure and the IIJA, they've gotten like over $100 billion. I don't know that you handle one office, but we're talking billions of dollars.
Thank you.
Yes.
It may be a matter of the labels. We do a financial statement every year, and it may be that the financial statement we do every year helps get what you're asking about. So
Well, I don't.
I might get back to you on that.
Yeah, I do. I would like you to get back. I don't see a financial statement being an audit, but we're going to continue to ask these questions. I yield back.
Okay.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. Thanks to Chairman Johnson for holding this hearing on the Environmental Protection Agency's Brownfield program. And I want to thank you, EPA Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator Breen, for being here to answer these important questions. In my home state of Georgia, there's the Atlantic Station in Midtown Atlanta. This is a 138-acre brownfield site revitalized in the early 2000s to an area where people can enjoy restaurants, housing, and green space. This project was successful through the EPA Brownfields grant program that allowed this former steel facility to be an economic benefit to that community. Bottom line, people are closer to Midtown Atlanta and the business district. Being a businessman, I'm always interested in the rate of return on government investments as far as programs like this. As we consider reauthorizing the Brownfields program, it's imperative that we continue to look at how to improve and ensure government resources are used properly. Administrator Breen, I understand that the EPA received $1.5 billion in funding for the Brownfields program under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Is that correct?
Yes.
You characterize the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding as supplemental in your testimony, indicating that the EPA is managing funding from both the IIJA and annual appropriations. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your testimony mentions a request for $177.94 million in annual appropriations for FY 2024 for the Brownfields program, which is less than annual appropriations for the program for FY 2023. How did EPA reach the $177.94 million request?
I'll need to get back to you for that.
Okay. Does that requested value extend beyond 2024?
We have a 2024 request pending with you, and we'll be developing a fiscal year 2025 request as part of the president's budget.
Okay. Well, my concern here is, does the influx of IIJA funding mean that EPA needs less in annual appropriations for the Brownsville program?
Well, I better once we put together the FY25 budget, I'd be in a better position to answer that.
Okay, and why would we not be able to determine that at this stage?
I just don't have it in my,
Okay.
in my material.
Okay, well, thank you, sir, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing. I want to thank Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator Barry Breen for giving you us your insights on the discussion draft and the Brownfields program more broadly. Mr. Breen, it's my understanding that the current grant application process is rigorous and includes local government engagement, but the Republican discussion draft would require concurrent approvals by a local or regional government before EPA could issue grant awards. What would be the unintended consequences of that approval model be, in your opinion?
We are concerned about the administrability of a local government concurrence as framed in the discussion draft. We do think local governments are indispensable in this program and many others, but it's the nature of the engagement, the formal concurrence rather than the ability to get comment and support back and forth. We do have a tested experience with the intergovernmental review, and it's the same that EPA uses in many, many programs, so it doesn't require a new learning by local governments or state governments or the federal grant-making officials. So there's some benefit in not disrupting it, but if there are examples where it hasn't worked, we'd like to understand those better.
Yeah, I just think it's an absolute, having an absolute veto is not a good idea, because there definitely are local governments that, because they think it doesn't look good, for the public or whatever, might just say no. So I agree with you. But the second question is that the discussion draft would make for-profit organizations eligible for the grant funds. And I mentioned in my opening statement that this is concerning to me because limited public funds, I don't think, should be going to for-profit entities when there are countless communities with unfunded grant applications. So do you have any concerns about opening the grant available to for-profit organizations?
We do understand the discussion draft to make private, for-profit, limited liability corporations eligible for cleanup and assessment grants, and we wonder whether it might have unintended consequences in two ways. It's certainly intended to have benefits, but we wonder if there might be disadvantages to be considered as well. Currently, limited liability corporations are eligible only to receive revolving loan funds. And we're concerned that the ability to compete for competitive grant funding could increase the competition for those limited grants, and that would limit the chances of small, rural, and disadvantaged communities to become the selected entities for those. At the same time, the revolving loan funds, which limited liability corporations are eligible to receive, need to be active and robust. And without limited liability corporation participation, they might not operate as intended, and so might not be a critical source of cleanup for small, rural, and low-capacity communities to receive them as well.
Well, thank you. My last question, obviously the Brownfields program has a long bipartisan history, and, we want to work with Republicans and Democrats to reauthorize and strengthen it. But unfortunately, I believe that the success of the Brownfields program would be put at risk by a potential Republican government shutdown. So I wanted to ask you how a government shutdown at this point would impact the Brownfields program.
That is something I'd need to get back to you on. I don't have the impacts well framed to be able to share back with you.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I guess my concern is that any government shutdown would certainly impact the program. My understanding is that grants wouldn't be processed, cleanups wouldn't be completed, communities looking for relief would be left waiting until the House gets its act together again. So if you could get back to me through the chair, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Breen, thank you for being here. Mr. Breen, what is environmental justice?
We have a definition. I don't have it with me, but there's an executive order that provides a definition.
Yeah, and I don't know what it is either. What about Justice 40? What's that?
Again, I could get you for the record, but I believe it has to do with 40%
40% of what?
of a program's benefits ought to go to disadvantaged. But again, let me get you
I would
that.
think that would be
for the
important
record.
to you, given your role as Deputy Assistant Administrator. But according to the website, White House website, Justice 40 initiative stipulates that at least 40% of the benefits of federal environmental investment must go to underserved or disadvantaged communities. What are underserved and disadvantaged communities?
So I'm gonna want to get you the exact definition to be precise.
Mr. Breen, looking at the EPA portion of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council's final recommendations for Justice 40 initiative that is apparently unclear what that really is. It was submitted to Congress May 20th of 2022. And there's numerous references to issues such as clean electric buses, getting lead out of drinking water, monitoring for buildings, refitting stormwater. My state is largely rural. I'm from the state of Idaho. Those are not the issues generally that come up in discussions that I have in rural Idaho. Do rural communities qualify under Justice 40 initiative for any of these funds, or do they have to do something unique to qualify?
Thank you.
Rural.
Thank you. We work very hard to make sure that rural communities have the outreach and the capacity they need for the Brownfields program. And we've had good experience. You might remember I just a moment ago used those statistics. Communities of fewer than 10,000 people actually get a better success rate than communities of more than 10,000 and even better than a 50,000 or more. We're having good success.
Given the nebulous definition of what environmental justice is, or even this Justice 40 initiative, it doesn't seem like there's a clear path for deserving communities that are specifically in rural areas to take advantage of this stuff. And like you, I struggle with what the definition is for these things. But from what I can tell, it really has nothing to do with environment and nothing to do with justice. And we struggle with this. There is a provision under CERCLA, Section 104 and 128, that applies to regional, state, and tribal applicants. Can you talk about that a little bit? Can you tell how we leverage that, how we can take advantage of that in a rural area?
Yes, and I'd like to offer that EPA staff from the regional office or headquarters or both could sit down with your staff and walk through what are the opportunities that governments in your district could make themselves more ready to take on. We work very hard to make sure that the rural communities have opportunities.
We would be happy to try to do that. Frankly, I don't have high expectations as a result of that. But I'll just close up my comments with this, Mr. Breen. I think, given everything going on right now in Congress and the looming potential of a shutdown, struggles over money, the debt that we're all struggling with, I think it's a very real possibility that the EPA is going to take a significant cut. And I would submit to you, this is one of the reasons why. it's programs like this being pushed by the administration in the name of so-called environmental justice that really doesn't have meaning other than it's a way to steer funds towards pet projects this administration wants to steer it to. And so when those cuts come through, I just want to be on record saying it's this kind of thing that's the reason why. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleague, Congressman Fletcher, I'd like to have a
It's
conversation.
Fulcher.
What is it?
Fulcher.
Fulcher? Excellent. Thank you, Congressman Fulcher. I'd like to address environmental justice, Justice 40 in rural communities. And Mr. Breen, I'd like to recommend that you study up on that information since you do work for the administration. It's very important that you have clarity in what those definitions are, especially if you work for the EPA, because those definitions are really clear, Mr. Breen. There are two components for environmental justice that's very important to understand. One is the fact that's been studied and has been shown through scientific literature that those that live in underserved, under-resourced communities bear the brunt of environmental pollutions. Okay, that's one aspect of environmental justice, is that, and oftentimes that's associated with minority populations, also rural populations. The second component of environmental justice is the historical fact that oftentimes decisions are made of where to put high-risk companies or high-risk debris or the possibility of or manufacturing that has high pollution. Those decisions are made without the consent or the consultation of those very exact same under-resourced, impoverished communities. And so the environmental justice movement is to reverse the disproportionate exposure to pollutions by rural and underserved communities, and by increasing the community's voice to have a say in decisions that will affect their health. So that's environmental justice. It's very clear. The literature is out there. I recommend that we can have hearings on those by environmental justice experts. Second, Justice 40. Justice 40 is very simple. Because historically resources do not go to rural areas or under-resourced areas, and those resources usually go to people that have the capacity to apply for them, big urban areas, Justice 40 is an intentional way to ensure that those that lack the resources and that have historically not received the resources get a fair shot at getting the resources and 40% of those resources, in fact. It's very clear. There's no vagueness in terms of this definition. It's an effort. It's an intent. I support it, and I would like to know if the administration is actually living up to that intent, because it is a good intent. The next question of not knowing what underserved and under-resourced means shows that people in Washington have really lost touch. It's very simple. Underserved communities are communities that lack the resources to meet its basic functions. And under-resourced usually leads to poverty in those communities, meaning very simply high unemployment rate, low median income rate, and high poverty rates. And yes, rural communities meet those definitions. Yes, Justice 40's intent is to help those communities in rural America that suffer from lack of access to infrastructure money, to schools, to hospitals, that have kept them in a state of poverty for generations. So yes, Justice 40 benefits rural communities. And I'll just give you a clear example. In the Northridge earthquake that happened in California, decisions were made to put the debris in underserved, under-resourced rural communities. Now, the rural communities are experiencing the effects of the contaminants from that debris, mountain of debris that was forcibly put in those communities. And after Tropical Storm Hillary, a lot of chemicals were draining from that, and there's kids in trailer parks that live around that are being exposed to that. So, Mr. Breen, my time is up, but I would highly encourage you, as a member of the EPA, of this administration, to please get clarity on what environmental justice is, and please get clarity in what the initiative of Justice 40 is, because the Brownsfield program is essentially making sure that under-resourced communities in rural areas and urban areas can get the funds to clean up their land, and because most of those contaminants are in underserved and minority communities. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Dr. Miller Meeks, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witness, Mr. Breen. As you've heard from my colleagues, the Brownfields program is an important opportunity to improve economic development in rural areas like my district in southeast Iowa, which also happens to have the highest rate of unemployment and the lowest wages throughout the state. Through fiscal year 2022, the program saw great success with over 800 jobs being created for each $100,000 grant investment in the assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan fund cooperative agreements. Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator Breen, like you stated in your opening remarks, this program can be vital in rural areas, considering that 72% of the fiscal year 2023 grants will serve communities with populations of less than 500,000. However, I noticed that you did not comment on the oversight provision of this discussion draft that requires internal audits of the Brownsfield program. So in follow-up to Chair Rogers, do you believe in the need for government oversight for this program?
Yes, this and practically every program would benefit from healthy oversight and transparency.
And are you concerned the EPA does not have the capacity to conduct an internal audit of the Brownsfield program?
We haven't had a lot of complaints about bad administration. We think we're doing a pretty good job.
So you believe that there needs to be oversight, but you're not concerned that you don't have the capacity to conduct an internal audit?
So the Inspector General, as it is an important and healthy part of our oversight, and our internal controls are considerable. So we'd want to make sure that the money that we're provided is spent to provide on-the-ground results for the communities we serve.
And as the chairwoman mentioned, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included a drastic increase in funding for the program, more than $300 million in additional funding a year on top of the annual appropriations. Can you expand more on the oversight that's been conducted to date on the IIJA funds?
Thank you. So I would probably do well to get back to you on the record for that, to get you a complete answer and to make sure that the important role of the Inspector General is well reflected.
Okay. And in your opinion, has the EPA's OIG's oversight positively or negatively impacted the Brownsfield program?
We benefit from a healthy Inspector General function.
And has the involvement of the EPA OIG in the Brownsfield program deterred any applicants?
Deterred any applicants?
Did it deter any applicants?
I don't have a good factual basis to answer that. I don't know.
Okay. And then this is more of an in general question. You could certainly respond in writing if you don't know the answer. So given that I'm in southeast Iowa and it's a rural state to us, and we have our health professional shortage areas, so when we look at what's defined as rural, typically it's not communities to the size of 50,000.
Yes.
It's communities that are 10,000 or 25,000 or less. So to me, 50,000 actually seems like a large city, not a rural community. So if you could, if you don't know, it would be nice to have the breakdown, and you mentioned this, you alluded to this earlier when you said that communities 10,000 and under do very well, have a high success rate. It would be nice to know what the breakdown is for communities under 10,000, 10 to 25,000, and 25 to 50,000. What's the success rate? And of the overall funds that are allocated, what percentage go to communities in that size?
I think we will be able to get that for you. I asked similar questions and was able to get answers, but I didn't ask precisely that question.
Yeah, so if you could get that information to us, that would be tremendously helpful, and because most of the communities in my district are actually, below 25,000. So I'd appreciate you submitting that to us in writing. Thank you so much, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the fact that we're holding this hearing because I think this is a very important issue, particularly as my colleagues have all pointed out, in terms of developing areas where people are suffering economic injustice. There are opportunities here, I think, to dramatically improve the economic viability of those communities. One of the things I want to talk to you about, Mr. Breen, is that there are more and more states are looking for ways to clean up sites with some flexibility. My understanding is that the EPA is supposed to give deference to state brownfield laws unless there's an imminent threat to human health. How often has the EPA decided to overrule state brownfield laws under those circumstances?
I'm not thinking of any recent examples, but I may not have them all available at my fingertips, so I do best to get back to you for that.
Could you check on that and
Yes.
provide that to the committee? Are there other circumstances where the EPA would overrule states' brownfield laws?
On a brownfields matter,
Yes, sir.
I'm not familiar with what you might be thinking of.
Well, no, it's a very straightforward question. Are there other cases where the EPA would circumvent a state's brownfield laws? Now, the one example that I presented to you was in cases where it was a danger to human health, but are there other instances where the EPA has intervened?
None that are occurring to me at the moment.
Could you check on that?
Yes.
And this is not an adversarial question. We're trying to get to solutions as we pursue this, and I thank you for providing information to us. Alabama passed a brownfields law that allows for innovative brownfield zones and flexibility, and I think there have been some issues raised about concerns about liability for a new owner. There's problems with current owners not doing anything to develop these locations because once they disturb the ground, then it opens up to a lot of issues. What I'd like to know is what sort of funding would be available to rehabilitate these sites, which in some instances might include sites that are owned by potential responsible parties. Is the EPA working in a collaborative manner with private owners to rehabilitate sites?
Where the owner is the responsible party?
Yes.
I am not sure that the statute enables that owner to apply for brownfields funding, but I have to get back to you.
Is that something that should be considered?
Well, there's a delicate balance to be struck. Let me ask folks to get you an answer for that on the record.
Well, my point is that where you have a company that may have acquired a site years ago that did not contribute to whatever might be in the ground or there, in order for them to allow that site to be developed for a more useful purpose, whether it's economic development or for a park or whatever, a lot of those companies can't afford to do that. So what my question would be, and something I think the committee should consider, is there a collaborative way to get those sites cleaned up so that they can be used again? And I'd like for you to look into that and respond back to the committee, and then, Mr. Chairman, maybe we could pursue this further and come up with a solution. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Breen, thank you for being here today. Section 2 of the discussion draft we're considering today proposes a new limited pilot program for EPA to aid 3 applicants in communities with a population of less than 50,000 people, and 2 applicants in communities with a population of 50,000 to 100,000 people. Can you discuss why it might be beneficial to have this funding provided on a non-competitive basis?
Thank you. The need to reach out, especially to small communities, is much appreciated, rural communities, small communities. We are working hard to do that outreach now, and so we have existing mechanisms for doing it. We don't have any technical assistance that say change this word or that word in that text that you've suggested.
Okay. There are 3 main types of cleanup, federally governed cleanups: corrective action, Superfund cleanups, and brownfield cleanups. Mr. Breen, are there lessons from the brownfields program that could be applied to Superfund or corrective action cleanups?
And thank you for the question. They all work together in our office. They are quite literally down the hall from one another. There is a lot of lessons to be learned, and on the science underlying land contamination, on the methods of cleanup. We have a pretty good expertise that we share across offices.
Okay, good to know. I understand that more than 20 years ago, brownfield cleanups were not occurring because parties interested in developing that land were worried about SERLAC liability applying to them if they got involved. Would you please walk me through the liability rules of this process, who it applies to, and whether it's appropriated, apportionated, and fault-based?
Thank you. That's a wonderful topic. I would do well.
I love the smile on your face, so I'm glad to hear that.
I would do well to do that for you in writing, because the rules are so complicated that a wrong choice of phrase might leave you with the wrong impression. So I would be better to get you back that.
I respect that. Thank you. The Brownfields law does not provide an exemption to liability, but rather defends us to liability. Could you explain the difference between those 2 concepts?
The difference between a defense and an exception?
Yes.
So I think...
Defense and liability. Defense.
Thank you. I think there is a distinction within Section 107 of CERCLA. There are some listed defenses and there are some listed exceptions, but the impact of being a defense versus an exception would be something I would need the Enforcement Office and the General Counsel's Office to respond to.
Okay. Well, we're moving right along here.
I'm sorry? Oh.
We're moving right along here. As it is possible that a brownfield applicant could become a potentially responsible party under SERLAC, I have a few more questions on the transparency of this process. Is liability for SERLAC sites covered by your office, the Enforcement Office, the regions, or some combination upon the cost and size of the cleanup?
Yeah, I think I understood your question. Are the liability
Yes.
provisions, who are they administered by? The national program guidance for the liability provisions would come from the Enforcement Office, and frequently it's the regional offices that actually apply it on a situation-by-situation basis.
Okay. Would you say that the liability provisions pursuant to SERLAC and relevant case law are administered uniformly in each area of the country?
We do our best to be consistent. Every situation has its own particular nature, so that one answer would not necessarily be the right answer in another situation, but we do our best to be consistent.
Thank you. And thank you for your promptness and your effective questions. I'm done, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my remaining time.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Green, for being here. It's an important program, affects every district, and I think it's great. I think this program has been very successful, and of course, it enjoys bipartisan support. There's been a few questions on how we assess who's eligible for a brownfield site, and I want to drill down into that a little bit if we can. And it does revolve around discussions about the administration's push for environmental justice initiatives, and that's defined in a bunch of different ways. Some of which make sense and some of which don't. And I think what we're always trying to figure out is what is the process for assessing? Is it risk-based? Or is it based on the median income of a community? If you've got a site that is clearly more contaminated than another site, but that other site is in what one would define as an underserved community, does that one get priority, even though the other site might be riskier? You assess risk, I'm assuming that's based on population, because if a site affects more people, then it's more risky. And so maybe walk us through how that assessment is done.
Thank you. The statute itself gives us 12 criteria, 12 ranking criteria, and some of them specifically call out particular factors. For example, a factor called out is the inability to draw on other resources, or being located in an area of small population or low income, or a need for fair distribution between urban and non-urban areas. So those are called out. We use those statutory criteria. We have ranking panels that assign points to each application. The regions are quite deeply engaged on this, and then those ranking panels and their points come forward to headquarters, and we try to make the money go as far as we can.
Yeah, so are you penalized if you're in a wealthier area?
Well, there is a low income is called out in the statute. I don't think you're being penalized if you're in a wealthy area. Just a criteria is low income communities are called out in particular.
You get extra points in the assessment.
I'd have to get you the framing point system. I don't have that in front of me.
Maybe that's fine, all else being equal, right? I mean, I think the concern I would have is if a more contaminated site becomes weighted less because of the conditions surrounding that site. In the end, the purpose of the program is to clean up contaminated sites, and we should always be prioritizing the actual cleanup and making risk assessments based on that.
Can I elaborate on that?
Sure.
So another one of our criteria is to address and facilitate reductions in threats to human health and the environment, particularly greater than normal incidence of disease or cancer or asthma or birth defects. So the actual risk to human health is front and center.
Okay. That's good to hear. Maybe in our remaining time, if you could say how the program's evolved. What steps have you taken to streamline and promote innovation in the application process, as well as the redevelopment efforts?
Thank
you. Want to
you.
highlight anything?
Thank you. The program began in the mid-1990s as doing our best to do what we could for communities that are neither completely uncontaminated nor so contaminated as to need Superfund designation. And we found that there's 450,000 by estimates in the middle. So we did what we could with the authority that we had. Thanks to this subcommittee's work and that of other applicable subcommittees, a statute was enacted a few years later to codify largely what we were doing. There have been some amendments over the years, but the basic framework from that 2002 statute has proven reliable and durable and productive, and so we get support from across the country.
Okay. And I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Mrs. Dingell, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this important hearing today to discuss reauthorizing the EPA's brownfield programs. And thanks to EPA for being here. As you know, I'm one of the biggest supporters of brownfields. It's had a long history, but the reason I'm one of the biggest supporters is because I have more of them than almost anybody in the country. And I would say to my colleague from Texas that unfortunately we see a lot of industrialized areas that there weren't, the population wasn't as well off. That is cleaning up sites from 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. But I do have it's not a brownfield site. It's finally going to get listed as a Superfund site in a more wealthy area that's a dachshund plume that's been there for 50 years. So we're still cleaning up a lot of places. But the EPA Brownfields program has had a long history of empowering states, local communities, and stakeholders to work together and to prevent contaminated sites from endangering public health and the environment. This program has had strong bipartisan support from members of this committee, and it's really important that this continue. I was very proud to welcome and help open EPA's annual Brownfields Conference held in Michigan. In my district, the Downriver Community Conference is managing one of the best brownfields programs in the country. Since its creation, the DCC has received and administered over $19 million in brownfield funding and assisted in more than 200 sites, accounting for over $600 million in total investment while creating jobs and increasing the tax base of the local downriver communities and restoring programs that needed to be cleaned up. And it has made my downrivers and other parts of my district, it's made them more beautiful again, vibrant, and a sustainable place to live, work, and visit. So having said that, and I'm very committed to getting this reauthorized and fully funded because I still have brownfields in my district that need you. But as you may have seen, today's discussion draft would create a new requirement for the EPA to conduct an annual internal audit of its brownfields programs and its awards. Administrator Breen, what mechanisms are in place to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the brownfield program, and how does the EPA use this feedback to make improvements?
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for speaking at the Brownfields Conference last month. You mentioned it just now, and we were thrilled. Thank you for being there. We do have an existing Inspector General program for the agency as a whole, including the Brownfields program. And we have pretty rigorous procedures for how we give grants, for the ranking criteria, numerical scores. We make sure that we bring together regions and the national staff to look at them. And there have not been a great deal of problems, but at the same time, oversight is always healthy. Transparency is necessary.
So let me ask you this. From a federal government's perspective, why is EPA's Brownfield program crucial for the overall environmental and economic health of communities?
Thank you. It fills a gap that wouldn't otherwise be filled between the very most contaminated property and green fields. And every time we invest in a brownfields, it means we have a pretty good shot at reusing infrastructure that has already been built. Roads, pipes, electric lines. Reusing those means that we don't have to plow up green space in order to make jobs. We can reuse space that's already got what it needs.
And could you elaborate on the ways in which federal investment in this program aligns with the broader environmental and economic goals of the EPA? And why should it be a priority for the federal government?
So one of the best things about it is we found a pretty good data set. We didn't go and cherry pick sites. We found sites where we had good data, and we just took all of the sites that we had good data on and compared what we invest to what tax revenue is received by local governments. And it's enormous. We invested, I think it's $12 million. I can get you the exact number. We invested our money, and then year after year after year, the local governments get increased tax returns thanks to the investments, all because some important seed money was provided. So there's better health care, there's better libraries, there's better police forces, thanks to those real estate taxes going up.
Thank you. I do want to say, Mr. Chairman, Brownfields funding does great work, and it does help bring communities back. I've got a lot of them. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back, and we will now transition to the second panel. Mr. Breen, thank you so much for your testimony today. You are excused, and I'll ask our guests to please take their seats for our second panel. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and I would remind our panelists when you begin to speak, please make sure your microphone is turned on and that it's pulled close. Would appreciate that. Our witnesses for the second panel today are the Honorable Christian Bollwage, Mayor of Elizabeth, New Jersey, on behalf of the Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities. Mayor Bollwage, welcome. The Honorable Tammy Tincher, President of the Greenbrier County Commission, on behalf of the National Association of Counties. Ms. Tincher, thank you. Ms. Leslie Melendez, the Executive Director for Groundwork Lawrence, on behalf of the National Brownfields Coalition. Thank you for joining us today. And Mr. Pat Ford, the Director of External Affairs and Business Development at Frontier Group of Companies. Mr. Ford, welcome. Mayor Bollwage, you get to go first. You're recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman McMorris Rogers, and the Ranking Member, Congressman Pallone, Subcommittee Chair Johnson, and Ranking Member Tomko. It's good to see you again, Congressman. And members of the subcommittee, I'm Chris Bollwage. Been the mayor of Elizabeth, New Jersey, fourth largest city since 1993, trustee of the Conference of Mayors, and I serve as chair of the Brownfields Task Force for 25 years. I've testified many times, not only here, but before the Senate, as well as the full House Committee to improve the Brownfields law. I'm honored to be here today on behalf of the Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities to share our priorities for reauthorizing EPA's Brownfields program. I cannot say strongly enough how effective this program has been and the federal program to help revitalize America's communities by putting abandoned or blighted property back to productive use. For city leaders, brownfield sites represent jobs, revitalize neighborhoods, increase the tax base, reuse and enhance already existing infrastructure. So that's exactly what we've done in my city through a variety of brownfield redevelopment projects along our waterfront, train station, throughout the community. We brought new market rate as well as affordable housing, job training opportunities, revitalized neighborhood, and provided new opportunities for economic growth. The story of success is one that is replicated in hundreds of communities throughout the country, as Brownfields program is a win for local governments, our environment, and economy. With these successes in mind, I want to thank the committee for the changes that were enacted in 2018 and in that reauthorization, as well as the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We have advocated for years for additional funding and higher caps on the grants, which could allow for redevelopment of harder to develop brownfield sites. And we are hopeful that the new influx of new resources will demonstrate this and that Congress would consider including these changes in the new reauthorization. My written testimony, Mr. Chairman, includes more context and explanation around additional priorities for the next authorization. But in short, more flexibility direction to EPA that would allow local governments to use multi-purpose grant funding for more broadly and any eligible brownfield activity within the community. Raise the administrative cost allowance from 5% to 10% will further support smaller communities. Allow communities to apply for an additional cleanup grant for a specific property, even if a community has already received a cleanup grant, as well as the ability to apply for an assessment grant for a community that has received a cleanup grant for that property. Require nonprofit entities to get sign-off from the city to ensure that the project is coordinated with local government efforts. We appreciate the discussion draft includes a provision on this issue. We also want to offer some comments on your discussion draft, concerns regarding allowing for-profit companies to apply to EPA cleanup grants for several reasons outlined in my written testimony. There's not enough money, number one, appropriated to fund the current number of grant applications, and we can believe Congress could help the private sector more effectively by reinstating the Brownfields tax credit. One of the biggest hurdles that small and medium-sized communities face is accessing federal funding and the lack of staff capacity. We're generally supportive of the draft discussions approving technical assistance for small and mid-sized communities. We would like to understand how this would impact EPA's current technical assistance program and learn more about how applicants would be selected for those 5 small and mid-sized communities. And on behalf of both the Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, we strongly encourage the committee to incorporate the infrastructure changes into the reauthorization bill. Our organizations stand ready to work with you to develop solutions that would further improve the Brownfields program. This is a program that many members of Congress have supported in the past. It's a proven track record of creating jobs, cleaning up contamination, and protecting the public health, and I urge you to support the reauthorization. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I thank you for allowing me to testify here today, and will answer and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And now, Ms. Tincher, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Ranking members Pallone and Rogers and Tonko, Chair Rogers and Tonko, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Tammy Tincher, and I serve as president of the Greenbrier County Commission in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, and I'm representing the National Association of Counties. Today's hearing is of great importance to my county and many others throughout the country, both urban and rural, who are tasked with protecting the environment, ensuring public health, and strengthening the economic vitality of their communities. The EPA Brownfields program is one of the most successful programs to help address vacant and abandoned sites at the local level, the redevelopment of which can reinvigorate entire communities and their economies. As a county commissioner, I have seen firsthand the positive effects that Brownfields redevelopment has had on my community. Greenbrier County is in southeastern West Virginia, and much of the northern and western parts of my county are either national forest, coal land, or private forest land. In years past, the communities in these areas were the commerce centers of Greenbrier County. The coal and forestry industries contributed to a robust economy in the county until their recent decline, which has left communities devastated. The EPA Brownfields program has been beneficial to Greenbrier County and other rural communities across the country by providing funds for the cleanup and redevelopment of contaminated sites, which helps to attract new business and provide opportunities for these once prosperous communities. This is particularly impactful for rural counties, which make up 70% of the nation's 3,069 county governments. Of the 353 counties that experience persistent poverty, 85% are rural, and the poverty rate in rural America is 2.5 percentage points higher than the national average. These challenges are exacerbated by the fact that in many states, counties are severely constrained in our ability to both raise and collect tax revenues. Despite these limitations, rural counties must still deliver essential services to our residents and visitors, such as road and bridge maintenance, law enforcement, and much more. These challenges hinder the potential of our rural communities and contribute to widening disparities between rural and urban areas. However, federal investment in rural communities through programs such as the Brownfields program presents a key opportunity to bolster rural economic development. Brownfields are traditionally thought of as an urban feature, and they're also found in most rural counties nationwide. Brownfields in rural areas can include railroad property, old gas stations, agriculture buildings, and more. The EPA Brownfields program is indispensable to revitalizing these sites in rural communities. For example, the program has been essential in helping to begin the renovation process for the former Rupert Elementary School in my county. The site has several auxiliary buildings that have been renovated to house Marvel, an early learning childhood center. The western end of Greenbrier County is a child care desert, and this development has allowed services to be provided to those families in need. Additionally, a gymnasium has been restored to provide athletic opportunities to community members of all ages. The major redevelopment on the campus, however, is the renovation of the 3-story school building, which will house a medical clinic on the first floor and senior and low-income housing on the second and third floors. All aspects of the project will bring a new life to the Meadow River Valley and create a community center that will be central to all residents. The previous uses of the buildings on the campus required the Brownfields assessments and inspections, and the funding provided by the EPA Brownfields program through the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection removed barriers to the redevelopment of the site. It's essential that federal resources remain available for Brownfields assessment cleanup and redevelopment, as well to provide incentives for private investment. We request increasing funding levels for the program. We recommend that Congress authorize and appropriate increased funding for the Brownfields program. Provide technical assistance to rural communities. Our capacities are limited, and the more barriers that we have to deal with grant applications and paperwork limits our ability to be able to redevelop and deploy the services that we need. In conclusion, counties recognize the importance of brownfields. We thank you for the opportunity to be able to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.
The lady yields her time back. Ms. Melendez, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important role the Brownfield program plays in revitalizing American communities. My name is Leslie Melendez, and I am appearing as the Executive Director of Groundwork Lawrence, representing the National Brownfields Coalition and Groundwork USA. Groundwork USA is a network of place-based, people-centered environmental justice organizations working in urban communities across the country to undo the legacy of environmental harm and create green, healthy, just, and resilient urban neighborhoods. Groundwork USA has a track record of community development and land revitalization spanning over 30 years. Groundwork Lawrence is a nonprofit organization in Lawrence, Massachusetts that is part of the larger Groundwork USA network. Groundwork Lawrence works to improve our city's physical environment by developing community-based partnerships which empower people, businesses, and organizations to promote environmental, economic, and social well-being. The National Brownfields Coalition is a nonpartisan alliance of nonprofits, academics, and public and private sector professionals who support the responsible cleanup and reuse of underutilized, blighted, or environmentally impacted land. Brownfield sites are stark evidence of the environmental justice issues that continue to impact many under-resourced communities. Brownfields, especially those in resource-constrained neighborhoods, are barriers to redevelopment and perpetuate a cycle of disinvestment. Since the 1980s, the environmental justice movement has tackled the disproportionate concentration of brownfield sites in low-income communities and communities of color. But the lack of positive environmental assets that help make a neighborhood a safe, enjoyable, healthy place to live, such as parks and play spaces, walking and biking infrastructure, tree cover and gardens, has often been overlooked. These items, which many wealthier communities take for granted, have generally been treated as nice-to-have amenities rather than essential components of a healthy community. As a Lawrence kid, growing up with more reasons to leave than to stay, the environment and its many benefits was not something I knew about. But I did notice the vacant lots, the absence of parks and open spaces, the lack of pride in the way the city looked or even smelled. I remember our rivers weren't the attractive recreational destinations that they are today. In fact, the area that Groundwork first focused on was the neighborhood I grew up in. For many outside of the city, it was considered the Dresden of Lawrence. Most of the large mill buildings were vacant and in disrepair. This was a time in Lawrence where the disinvestment across the city was never more evident. In 2004, I joined the fledgling Groundwork Lawrence. The small organization began to change the way I saw my home, the way I thought about how things could change for the better, and provided me a new way to see how I could fit into that change. Groundwork Lawrence believes the brownfield redevelopment is a long-term economic development strategy for underserved communities. Community-driven brownfield projects offer opportunities to counter disinvestment and build community wealth by creating jobs, educational opportunities for youth, and multiple ways for residents to become long-term stewards of their shared environment. Brownfield projects yield a triple bottom line of equity, health, and economic opportunity for communities that would otherwise be left behind. My first large brownfield project in Lawrence was a 2.7-acre site in one of the densest neighborhoods in the city. Picture, if you will, a cement lot, long fenced off and forgotten by its owners. The community wanted more open space. That is when GWL began to work with the neighbors to design a space to call their own. The design process took place in a neighbor's living room and included the Groundwork team, a landscape architect, and a group of neighbors who had invested their time and energy. Despite some roadblocks, we persevered and cut the ribbon on Dr. Nina Scarito Park in 2006. Today, the park is one of the most beautiful green spaces along the Spicket River Greenway, a 3.1-mile greenway in the heart of the city that connects 10 parks, 4 of which were former brownfields. These restored sites give residents a place to recreate, a place to socialize, and most importantly, a place to feel proud of. And they would not have been possible without the support of the Brownfields program. Groundwork Lawrence is proud of our brownfield accomplishments. With over $25 million in investment, including EPA Brownfields funding, we have been able to redevelop and create over 25 parks, 4 of those being brownfields to green space projects that have helped to increase property value, provide residents much-needed green space, and change the way people view the community in Lawrence. I hope that what I have shared with you today makes it clear that it is critical to continue to invest in the Brownfields program. Doing so ensures that places like Lawrence can continue to convert once derelict spaces into thriving, sustainable, and multi-generational community assets. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Melendez. Mr. Ford, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, and committee members. It's an honor and privilege to return before you and to testify with regards to what I believe to be the single most effective economic development tool in the hands of the federal government, the Brownfields program housed in the U.S. EPA. Thank you, Deputy Administrator Breen and the EPA staff for 10 years of supporting our projects, for which I've been involved, totaling approximately $3 million of public investment from the U.S. EPA, which has leveraged almost $2 billion of private investment in only 3 counties in West Virginia and Ohio. I am fortunate to have had every role one could imagine in the repurposing of a brownfield in communities as small as 250 to as large as 300,000. I've been the permit reviewer, the site planner, the enforcement officer, the funder, the collaborator, the policy administrator, property owner, and developer. What I have learned on my career trajectory is that the market doesn't take care of brownfields. There is no such thing as a conventional approach to brownfield development. There is no such thing as conventional financing in brownfield development. Brownfields continue to have a stigma, and even in the United States of America, people's appetite for risk still has a limit. And that limit has been the private investment of brownfields. That is,
until the US EPA stepped in to share the shoes of captains of industry. We are still, as a country, figuring out how to mend the disruptions of our domestic and international supply chains. I would argue that the most logical solution to these disruptions is the repurposing of brownfields. Our most critical and strategically located brownfields, our mega sites, are within 8 hours of 50% of our country's industrial output and 50% of America's population. These same brownfields, abandoned brownfields, have the bones of infrastructure in place to support and transform our country's energy generation and industrial growth for the remainder of this century. We must keep our large brownfields in our country's industrial inventory. We must provide the EPA with the resources, regulatory and monetary, to ready these sites for economic development and at the pace of business and with business. It is cost prohibitive to take a greenfield and recreate the infrastructure that exists in our industrial brownfields, where we have roads, rail, river access, and the workforce with the muscle memory to perform the work. There is no better time than now to put these forgotten pockets of our proud industrial heritage back into play and breathe life back into the bones of our abandoned mill and factory sites, located in states and towns that desperately need the jobs and the tax base to support the services and the schools. Who in our national economy's operating room is equipped to breathe life back into the bones of our brownfields, our industrial megasites? You will find them at 1200 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest. You will find no better agency than the EPA that is equipped to reinvigorate communities that have fallen on hard times, where they've lost energy production, shuttered mills. The EPA understands the importance of leverage, private investment, risk share, and where to fit in the capital stack. We are at a critical juncture in our country's industrial renaissance, where international companies are moving operations into the US, US-based companies that moved abroad are moving back, supply chain disruptions are being corrected, and some government agencies have figured out how to move at the pace of business. Now is not the time to tap the brakes. The US EPA is on a natural trajectory. They are building on-ramps to growing our country's industrial output highway in a collaborative, affordable, and time-sensitive manner. We need to keep our foot on the accelerator and make the on-ramp to our industrial highway more accessible to others, and that includes the private sector, and give the US EPA the fuel they need to take us to economic and energy independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Gentleman yields back. We'll now go into the questions, and Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes to begin that process. Commissioner Tincher, I represent several rural counties with populations less than 50,000 and believe that brownfields grants can spur environmental cleanup, job creation, and community revitalization. Do you have an opinion about what currently prevents or discourages small rural communities from applying for brownfields grants?
Certainly, thank you for the question. I believe one of the biggest barriers is capacity for rural counties. Capacity limits of staffing, limitations on abilities to go through in-depth.
The grant writing process?
Absolutely, yes,
So
sir.
you mentioned technical assistance. Is that part of the technical assistance you think that they could use help with?
Absolutely. We find that it's very important to have technical assistance on so many projects. It's greatly helpful to rural communities and counties and would be extremely beneficial.
Sure. Well, I could talk about the impacts and the benefits, but I'd like to hear from you. What do you think the impacts of a Brownfields grant, what would it be for a community of that size, for 50,000 or less?
Certainly. My communities, Greenbrier County itself is 32,000 people. Our largest municipality is 3,600 people. The areas that I spoke about in my testimony, the western areas of the county, we have municipalities that have 800 people. And so much of those areas that I spoke of are very limited in opportunity right now because of the loss of industry that we previously had in our area. We had the largest hardwood lumber mill in the world in my community where I live. In 1975, it closed, and our community has not recovered since.
Okay.
We are faced with dilapidated and abandoned buildings, empty storefronts, and the Brownfields program allows us to be able to begin the process of redevelopment. It allows us the opportunity to look at new ways to bring energy and revitalization back into our communities that we have not had in a very long time.
Okay. I'm sure you've seen the discussion draft, I presume. How would the Rural Brownfields Showcase Pilot Program in that discussion draft benefit rural, non-suburban communities like you're talking about?
I believe it would be very helpful to provide opportunities to these rural counties and communities to just have promotion of the program, to be able to have interest and show the communities that there's opportunity, that instead of having the abandoned areas or the underutilized areas that have been in their communities for years, looking at ways to revitalize and provide future opportunities is a tremendous for a community's energy and those who have boots on the ground and actually doing the work.
Okay. Mr. Ford, can you explain how the Brownfields program effectively leverages private capital for cleanup and economic revitalization?
What's interesting about this program is that if you look at the capacity that exists in most of these areas, primarily rural, even outside our suburban areas, they have historically been drained by wealth and industry. And what we've been able to do is follow a roadmap that basically includes three ingredients to leverage private investment: collaboration and concurrence, working with the local economic development agencies, providing our technical assistance and capacity in being able to bring the private sector in to self-perform the work, and then also collaborate and work with our local, state, and federal officials to make sure that these sites are treated as a priority for industries that are looking to onshore, reshore, or expand. And with that formula, we've been able to work with communities as small as Beach Bottom in West Virginia, Mingo Junction in Ohio, to bring back industry, both our traditional value-added steel industries and also the industries of tomorrow, such as battery manufacturing, to leverage, again, almost $2 billion of private investment just in those areas.
Okay. Very quickly, how long does it take to complete a typical Brownfields project?
Well, if you are on the private side and using just our money, I will tell you it took us 7 years to get a certificate of completion from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection.
It's not a short process.
It's not a short process.
Okay. My time has expired. Commissioner Tincher and Mr. Ford, if either of you have any additional suggestions to improve EPA's Brownfields program for smaller communities, would you please let our committee know? Okay, thank you. I yield back, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I mentioned in my opening statement that the last reauthorization effort was based on longstanding recommendations that had support from all of the major Brownfield stakeholders. I also mentioned that the proposed funding level in this discussion draft has been left blank. So for each of our panelists, my question is, with that in mind, do you believe the increased funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law has been positive for the program? We'll start with the mayor.
Absolutely, Congressman. It's given more flexibility to the grant process. It's given additional funding not only to municipalities, but to counties as well, and something we strongly encourage.
Okay, thank you.
I would reiterate what the mayor just said. It has been extremely helpful for our rural communities and counties to be able to begin projects, to look at opportunities that we may not have even considered previously because of the increased funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Melendez, please.
Thank you. Yes, it has helped. It will continue to help. One of the biggest things that Mr. Green had alluded to earlier today was that there was only 30% worth of applications were able to be approved. And since the additional funding, that has grown to more than 50%. Continuing that pattern is going to be very important for all communities.
Thank you. And Mr. Ford?
Mr. Tonko, absolutely. And what I will say, what has been particularly attractive from the position that I've been is the trajectory of the expansion of the program and also the money that comes with it. You've expanded at one time to include nonprofits, and additional funding came with that. And also, if you look at where we started and where we are now, when we first started this program, you know, it was the low-hanging fruit that was getting cleaned up. And we're at that stage in the evolution of our industrial society that it's the heavier, larger mega sites that need that cleanup done. And that additional money with the additional capacity will definitely go a long way to helping us ready these sites for future industrial development.
Thank you very much. And again, across the board, as the committee considers how to fill in the blanks on authorization levels, would you be supportive of amounts that reflect the recent increased funding administered by that program? And I'll ask for a yes or no answer, and we'll start again with the mayor, please.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and we would just encourage that it remains competitive to make sure that we get the maximum leverage from those dollars. Thank you.
Thank you. The last reauthorization effort created multi-purpose grant opportunities. The intention was to provide greater flexibility to local governments that may have multiple brownfields within their jurisdictions. Under one application, an assessment or cleanup plan could be shifted based on the local community's needs and the opportunity for successful redevelopment. So, Mayor Bollwage, do you believe these multi-purpose grants are a good option for many communities?
Absolutely, Congressman. When I first testified in the 1990s on this issue, that was not part of the process, and it's evolved where multi-purpose grants afford not only mayors and city councils and county governments more opportunities, but gives them flexibility, which is extremely important in the process.
So I believe you had a recommendation also, right, for how multi-purpose grants could be approved by EPA, allowing for greater flexibility. Can you explain how these grants may not be fully achieving their original intent, Mr. Mayor?
The flexibility that could occur in multi-purpose grants, one of the things in its strength is you could work with not only affordable, but market rate housing as well. The community can decide what the needs for their community will be best to contribute to the economic vitality. For example, many communities face challenges with having the adequate affordable housing component. And in this case, with the multi-purpose grants, it's about creating a community where people want to live, work, and play, and that also helps the support system and the economic opportunities in place.
Okay, for the remaining panelists, Commissioner Tincher and Ms. Melendez and Mr. Ford, I would ask if you could share in writing, because I'm running out of time, any thoughts that you have that might add on the value of multi-purpose grants. Okay, I would appreciate that input too. So with that, I've exhausted my time, and I thank you all for your response and your testimony. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here. We appreciate you taking time out to spend with us and share your expertise with us. Mr. Mayor, I was a mayor in a past life, and I know how important it is to have buy-in on projects like this, to have the community to be a part of this. And in fact, in the first panel, I cited two great examples in my district alone where we've had great success in turning brownfields into projects, such as on Jekyll Island with the Georgia Sea Turtle Center, which is just an outstanding facility that we're very proud of. And And then in the northern part of my district in Savannah, Delaney Industries completed the largest by-area brownfield cleanup in the history of Georgia. And it's just a great facility now and by a great corporate citizen. So there are examples of where where it can succeed and where we can be successful. The discussion draft contains language that requires brownfield applications contain local government concurrence. Do you think that's a good idea, a bad idea?
Congressman, as a mayor, I'd like to be involved in all of the grants that are put forth through the city, whether it be nonprofit or for-profit. Perfect example is we originally received one of the original $200,000 grants. We used that to leverage a 166-acre landfill into a 2 million square foot mall with 4 hotels. And without that $200,000 grant, it wouldn't have happened. But the government applied for it on behalf of the for-profit industry that eventually developed on that location. So there should be some type of involvement. Oftentimes, when local governments have to deal with the Congress, the definition of the language becomes something of a struggle. So concurrence could mean a lot of things. I want to know about it, though. Yes.
Okay. Well, tell me about your experiences with EPA and how they have been doing to help communities understand these sites and the potential that they have.
So my city is the 4th largest city in the state of New Jersey, and we have a lot of the expertise in the government in order to apply for the grants, then work with the EPA. We've worked very closely with our regional office in order to succeed, and I've always had the ability to stay in contact with them, and questions were answered rather quickly.
Any one of you had experience with smaller cities? I mean, obviously you're truthful in telling us that you got the personnel, but a lot of these smaller municipalities just don't have that. Mr. Ford, you had any experience with that?
Excuse me. Absolutely. One has to just look at Beach Bottom, West Virginia. It was a home of an abandoned former Wheeling Pit steel mill, population of 250, no staff, volunteer mayor. And we worked closely with that community to bring resources, to actually bring in outside private capital from California and Indiana to repurpose that. And we did it with local concurrence. Without concurrence, you're actually robbing the project of a partner. And that's why we find it critical that the public and private sector work together, and there is concurrence.
So what was your experience with the EPA? Were they cooperative as well?
Actually, they provided us with a number of resources. They provided us with a targeted brownfields assessment grant, which was the technical assistance to help us get our head around the project. It was actually our first large brownfield project. And then they followed up helping us bifurcate the site to get multiple grants for cleanup and remediation of that site, to ready that site for industries to move in.
You spoke earlier, Mr. Ford, about the competitive grant process and how you believe in that. And I know that you've testified before, and I've had the opportunity to hear you talk about it. For the benefit of those who haven't on this committee, how does promoting a competitive grant process rather than one that seeks to ensure all who apply get funding, how is that better?
I think it's simple. I mean, without competition, it simply becomes a lottery, and you're just really giving it money out on a first-come, first-served basis without really consideration for capacity, ability to deliver, ability to set up a plan, ability to understand how to characterize the site, and also the ability to understand what that end use in mind. All of those considerations, including the capacity to self-perform that work, need to be included. And without competition, where's the threshold criteria to determine how to best leverage those precious federal resources to bring private investment and jobs to these sites?
Great. Again, all of you, thank you for being here. It's extremely important. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by talking to Ms. Menendez. I want to get your name right.
Melendez.
What is it?
Melendez.
Melendez. Okay, there we go. No, that's still not right. Melendez. Okay, I'm sorry. I got your name,
Leslie.
but I know who I'm talking to.
You can call me Leslie.
All right, thank you. So I just want to say that I was very proud to help pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which put $1.5 billion into brownfield, addressing them. But as we look to make the improvements that we want, we have to make sure that we are also really focusing on environmental justice communities. And that's what I want to talk to you about. Brownfield programs can certainly help by reducing pollution, et cetera, in some communities. But I am also concerned about some unintended consequences like gentrification that can happen when there are these brownfield improvements. So I wanted to ask you, Ms. Melendez, the issue of gentrification or loss of affordable housing in these communities, is that a concern? And is that something that we ought to watch out for to make sure that people who have been in those communities are going to be able to continue to benefit from the brownfield improvements?
Thank you. Yes, gentrification isn't a thing that is somewhere out there. It's happening in our communities every day. And one of the ways to help battle that is by doing equitable development. And when we're looking at, by that I mean that when we're looking at redeveloping a brownfield site, it is based on not just what the community of municipal leaders and business people want, but also what the residents of the community are looking for. And how you bring residents into the process from the very beginning so that they are able to inform the process, so that they are able to become, to support the development and the design of the process, and then of the project ultimately, so that they become the stewards of the project, so that they know that they are a part of the community and they can stay in their community. It is really difficult to deal with some of these brownfield projects that get redeveloped to be high-end high-rises or live, work, play. We want all of those things in our communities, but we want them done in an equitable way so that the folks that have been living there for generations don't get pushed out.
Thank you. In a way for you, Mayor, the question is similar, really. I know that when we talk about private sector involvement, and I know what you have been so involved in making sure that you're collaborating with the Environmental Protection Agency and state and local governments, and that is also true of yours, your community as well. But I'm a little bit concerned about the role of then the private sector and using precious federal dollars for the private sector, and how our communities going to continue to be helping to shape what is going to happen in their communities. Am I right to worry a little bit about that?
Yes. If it was just up to the private sector, then brownfields would have been cleaned up a long time ago. And, you know, private sectors have the ability to generate their own income. And frankly, if private sectors are going to apply for the money without the backing of the municipality, I see that as a negative. When we applied for a brownfields grant to do our Hope 6 project, based on your previous question, Congresswoman, I made sure that all of the tenants who lived in the public housing had a lawyer, had access to legal representation, also that they sat in a room and picked the developer, and to make sure gentrification did not occur. And the 555 families who lived there all had the opportunity to move back into the new apartments. They had the first choice. And so therefore, the protection of the existing people who lived in my community going forward. But to strictly leave the opportunity for for-profit companies to apply for brownfield grants without the input and the consultation of the municipalities will be a negative on urban communities.
Thank you. I'm sorry out of time. I did want to hear from you as well. Maybe I can get something in writing. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cleaning up these brownfield sites has been pointed out numerous times, is very important, not only to urban areas, but to rural areas. I grew up in a very rural part of North Alabama, and when Ms. Tincher mentioned sawmill, my dad was a logger. I grew up skinning logs and mules and loved going to the sawmill. But most of those don't exist anymore. I also grew up near an area where they did a lot of coal mining and been a lot of reclamation, but some of it wasn't. I now represent the area around Birmingham, Alabama, and there are thousands of acres in the urban area that could be cleaned up, used for new schools, for businesses. As you know, a lot of these urban areas suffer as food deserts. They don't have local access to shopping, grocery stores and drugstores and things like that. And one of the things that I brought up with the previous panel with the gentleman from the EPA is working with the companies that own these facilities, the owners. Because a lot of times they don't want to do anything. They don't want to sell the property. They don't want to develop the property because once they disturb the ground, then there could be problems. And trying to figure out a way that, and working with the states, Alabama has some very innovative brownfields revitalization laws, and getting a collaborative arrangement where the EPA can work with the state, and the EPA could work with a private company. Ms. Tincher, you talked about some of this a little bit, and I know Ms. Melendez, you did too, so I'd like for the two of you to respond.
I believe it is advantageous for counties to collaborate in all aspects of every work that they do, especially rural counties, because we are limited with our capacity, as I mentioned. As far as counties go and working with private companies, I believe it can be beneficial. As the mayor mentioned, I believe having that oversight, having opportunities to be able to collaborate and look at different ways that these private businesses could utilize the properties in the future once brownfields are cleaned up. Opportunities to be able to have municipal and county funding versus state funding, and different ways to be able to work with getting the funding to be able to do the job. So, but with that, having that oversight.
What about, though, working with a private company? If they own the property, working in a collaborative manner where they can, follow the regulations, but clean up the site themselves, but not be exposed to litigation, which is the single biggest impediment
Absolutely.
to redeveloping these sites.
I think opportunities to be able to look at transferring properties to economic development associations, to be able to possibly utilize federal funding, and having agreements in place to be able to, once work is completed, to be able to transfer back. There are opportunities to do that, and looking at ways, as I mentioned, to collaborate with the industries, because all counties, and especially rural counties, if there's an opportunity for an industry to come to your area, it is going to help you. But to have guardrails in place and the opportunity to have the government, local government oversight and involvement is very, very important.
Ms. Melendez, just quickly respond, but I think we talk a lot about environmental injustice, but I really think that we reach a point sometimes where we create an economic injustice. And,
Agreed.
Yeah. Mr. Ford, there are a lot of brownfield sites where they don't have the economic activity, but cleaning up the sites alone does not increase the economic viability of an area. If we want these sites cleaned up, we want to increase the quality of life of people. Wouldn't it make sense to work, as I said, in a collaborative manner between the private sector companies and state and local government or federal government?
Absolutely, and the reason why they remain in their current situation is that people do not want to take on that environmental liability.
Ms. Tincher, this really has nothing to do with the hearing, but where did you grow up? Is that where the sawmill was, or was that somewhere else?
I grew up in Virginia, just right over the border, from Greenbrier County. But the sawmill, or the Meadow River Lumber Company, was in Raynell, West Virginia, which is on the western end of Greenbrier County, which we border the I-64 corridor adjoining Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields, and now the chair recognizes my friend and colleague from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. I want to talk about one application of the redevelopment of brownfields for clean energy. We know we have to build clean energy to meet our climate goals. According to Energy Innovation, to reach 80% clean power by 2030, we have to add about 1,000 gigawatts of new solar and wind capacity, which is about 125 gigawatts a year, and that will require us to deploy solar and wind projects at 4 times our historical record pace of 30 gigawatts in 2021. As I've raised repeatedly in this committee and elsewhere, we won't hit these targets with financial incentives alone. We need comprehensive clean energy permitting and siting reform, and today we're discussing the EPA's Brownfields program. Brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Currently, brownfields are often underutilized, abandoned, or closed, which has negative economic and environmental impacts on local communities. We need to find innovative ways to clean up contaminated sites and bring new economic opportunities to local communities. The clean energy transition provides us with an opportunity to do that. And Commissioner Tincher, I wonder if you feel we should incentivize the development of clean energy, clean infrastructure development on brownfields, and what kind of economic, environmental, social benefits could clean infrastructure development on brownfields provide?
Thank you for the question. I think it's very important that the communities and counties have the involvement in helping to make decisions or recognize the needs for the future of their counties and communities. And if green energy is able to fit into that structure, that's tremendous. If it's not, then those areas need to look at ways to be able to utilize, whether it be tourism, small business. In my county, we are very limited on flat land, very limited on opportunities for certain types of green energy. So we have had to look at other options. So I think it's very important to recognize the areas that are utilizing the brownfields and what is going to work best.
Okay. And Mayor, could I ask you what opportunities you think exist for brownfields for clean energy deployment? What do you think Congress should do to consider that kind of proposal?
I can only tell you, Mr. Congressman, things that we did in our city, and we used a brownfields grant in order to help stimulate a senior building of about 40 units of affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And in the construction that we worked with the developer to make sure it was what's called LEED certified in New Jersey, and a gold certificate with rain spouts and clean energy in the building. So brownfield grants are essential for everything we've described in creating opportunities and jobs and housing. Okay. But if you work with the developer, you can do what we call in New Jersey LEED certified at a gold level.
Great, okay. Mr. Ford, I practiced law in the area of CERCLA, the Superfund law. It imposes strict liability on folks who generate or aggravate sort of the conditions of contamination. That's discouraging a lot of people, I think you said, from investing, even though they certainly wouldn't make things worse. They would be improving the condition. I'm interested in providing liability protection. Maybe this is something that Mr. Palmer mentioned too. Under CERCLA for clean energy developers building on brownfields. Do you think that would be a good idea? Do you have an opinion on that kind of proposal?
Absolutely, sir. And actually, as I speak here today, we've acquired probably a half a dozen power plants from power companies under an environmental liability transfer project to take title to repurpose these sites. And in fact, we are right now looking at hydrogen, solid waste, and solar on a number of those sites. And to accelerate that process and ability to get those sites online to accommodate those end uses, we would love to see some incentives from US EPA on the front end,
Right.
As opposed to the back end where you're seeing some of the other federal agencies supply support.
Well, liability protection on the front end would help you under CERCLA, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the very capable vice chair of this subcommittee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you, Chairman Johnson, for holding today's hearing on the EPA Brownfields program, and for all of the witnesses for joining us here on this second panel. It's encouraging to see witnesses here from places that have experienced similar economic circumstances that many of the towns that I represent in South Central and Southwestern Pennsylvania's 13th Congressional District have also experienced, and your ability to speak to how useful this program can definitely be. The EPA's Brownfields programs is a great tool to stop areas of our country from being left behind and enable local stakeholders to leverage federal dollars to get their communities back on their economic feet. I have seen how successful these efforts have been in my hometown of Altoona, Pennsylvania, where a Brownfields grant helped encourage downtown redevelopment by jump-starting investment. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Brownfields funds were used to build the Greater Johnstown High School. Another Brownfields grant in Johnstown redeveloped the Cambria Iron Works, repurposing older industrial buildings in an area that can attract visitors and residents while creating opportunities for new manufacturing jobs. In the last few years, 3 Brownfields grants have been awarded in my district by the EPA. 2 are in Western Pennsylvania in Cambria and Somerset counties, and 1 helps capitalize a $1 million Brownfields revolving fund that covers Mifflin, Perry, and Juniata counties. Across my district, I can elaborate on the different success stories of local communities taking advantage of this program to bring their towns back to life. Commissioner Tincher, like Pennsylvania, West Virginia has a proud coal mining heritage. That history is at the core of many communities across Appalachia. The short-sighted transition away from coal as an energy source has had a crushing economic impact on many communities that have kept the lights on for millions of Americans. I am concerned that some in Washington think that the solution is to use brownfields to build solar fields or wind farms. I would much rather see this program be deployed to stimulate small businesses and entrepreneurs and create permanent family-sustaining jobs. Commissioner Tincher, it seems to me that simply putting windmills and solar panels in these towns may generate tax revenue and a few temporary construction jobs, but not the broader long-term employment opportunities that you spoke about. Do you agree?
Thank you. It is very important for a community to have the human capital, the workforce, and overall lived experiences, and that is what makes a community. Redevelopment and revitalization of our areas in West Virginia that have experienced a downturn in their economy from the loss of coal industry has been one of where we've had to think out of the box to figure out what works best. As I mentioned, we are very limited on flat land in West Virginia, so there's not going to be a lot of opportunities for large areas to be developed So we have to look at ways to bring our communities back to life, to bring opportunity for the impoverished to have opportunities to have jobs and increase our economies in our small communities. All of this will require the Brownfields program funding to clean up these past industrial areas. And so it's extremely important for us to look at the opportunities that will work best for our areas.
Continuing, Mr. Ford, in your testimony, you indicated that one of the benefits of the Brownfields program is that the applicants, the community, the developers, all have skin in the game. In my home state of Pennsylvania, it is vital and is a part of what we have with success in these programs. Can you explain why you feel that skin in the game is so important for individuals to be successful in utilizing these Brownfields funds?
Yes, sir. What's interesting about the success of all of the brownfield projects that we've been involved in, and also some folks that are working in this space, is that everybody shares the risk. Everybody has this stake in it. Everybody feels the pain that if something goes bad. Everybody has ownership in that site. If someone doesn't have skin in the game, they can simply walk away from the project and the project dies. And then it even becomes more difficult to jumpstart that project.
What would happen if the EPA were to waive all that cost sharing, that skin in the game? What would happen to the Brownfields programs?
It takes a pretty strong disposition to get into this business. And it is very easy to walk away if things go bad. A lot of the organizations that get access to this money literally live and work year to year. Their operations come from the state and federal government. If they don't have skin in the game, and if things go south, those projects will die and they will not get resurrected, and you will see a number of brownfield projects fail, I believe.
I thank all the witnesses for participating today. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Bollwage, it's good to see you again. You've been coming here for so many years, representing the national conference on, talking about the Brownfields program, and I know you've done a lot of that work in Elizabeth, in your town as well, so thank you for being here. In your testimony, which I missed because we had another subcommittee hearing, you appeared to share my concerns that the Republicans' discussion draft provides an opportunity for private companies to access Brownfields grant funding. Can you just elaborate on your concerns in that regard, Mayor?
Thank you, Congressman. It's always good to see you as well. And, the concerns regarding the addition, as I spoke about it earlier, for-profit companies, to fund the current number of grant applications, first of all, there's not enough resources in this bill. Second, the private sector already can take advantage of many of the revolving loan funds that exist. And third, when we first approached Congress, and I testified 25, 30 years ago about this, I've been here that long, it was Brownfields wouldn't be here if private sector wanted to clean them up anyway. So the Brownfields program helped local governments deal with the issue, as well as, dealing with the responsibility for contamination and limiting the funding to local governments in order to give it to for-profit governments, I think, in my humble opinion, would defeat the purpose.
Oh, well, thanks. I share your concern. But you also mentioned that under the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA was given the ability to award larger grants, but the agency hasn't really taken advantage of this authority. So could you expand on that? What new opportunities would higher Brownfields grant amounts unlock for communities?
Well, it would create a lot more flexibility, Mr. Pallone, and it would give the municipalities the ability to work not only with county governments and state governments in order to develop the brownfields, but it would give us more options and the flexibility of the program and more funding. Clearly, the funding has been flat, as you know, since the existence of the Brownfields program. The infrastructure bill, by going up to $1.5 billion, has created a lot of opportunities
for not only urban communities, but rural communities as well.
Exactly. All right, thanks a lot. Let me go to Director Melendez. In your testimony, you spoke about how during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was clear that having access to outdoor space was a critical need for your community. How has your community continued to use the brownfields to green space sites, and what additional benefits did you notice after these sites were completed?
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. We continue today to see the use of the Brownfields to Green Space project. So the Dr. Nina Scaruto project that I referred to in my testimony is one of those spaces that continues to be used, although the neighborhood changes, because in communities like Lawrence, you have waves of immigrants that come in and go and come in and go, but they continue to use the space in a way that it was intended. They continue to take care of the space in ways that it was intended. So being able to make sure that these spaces continue to be stewarded by the very people that helped to create them has been extremely important for us in terms of using brownfields, of doing brownfields to green spaces. And I think one of the most important pieces here, for whether it's an urban area or a rural area, is that community be at the center of all of this. That community voice be first and foremost as we think about how we redevelop these sites. Sometimes we're all not gonna agree, and we understand that. Some things need to be housing, some things need to be commercial, some things need to be green spaces. But making sure that all the voices are at the table to make sure that those conversations continue to happen so that people do continue to steward these spaces, whether they are commercial, residential, or green space, is extremely important as we continue moving forward with this program and many other programs like it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, you can imagine in New Jersey, which is the most densely populated state, we always like to use the sites for green space, right? But, you know, it depends. We have all three that you mentioned, right? But the green space is particularly important to me. So thank you, Mayor. Thank you, all of you, for your input, because it's going to be very valuable as we move forward to try to reauthorize this and hopefully get more funding. So I appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
I want to thank Chair Johnson for holding this second panel so we can hear from stakeholders on the Environmental Protection Agency's Brownfields program. As I mentioned earlier in the earlier hearing with EPA Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator, when he was testifying in my home state of Georgia, there is Atlantic Station, which you're probably familiar with, a huge redeveloped steel facility in Midtown Atlanta. This location is an example of how the EPA Brownfields grant program can be used in a successful manner and receive tremendous economic benefit from it. I would also ask all members of the committee to consider not only how this program may be used to revitalize land in large metropolitan areas, but also in rural America, which I primarily represent. Mr. Ford, from your experience, could you speak to the importance of brownfield programs being utilized also in rural communities?
Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, if you look at all of the large mega sites that we are currently working on, all of them are in rural areas, of which the population rarely peaks above 20,000 people and go down to as low as 250 people. And over the past 100 years, all of these communities were homes to the steel mills, textile factories, pulp factories. And slowly over the last decades, we've been draining these areas of these resources and the wealth by moving the industries out. And we're at a great time where we can take advantage of the decisions that were made by our forefathers to move those industries there, to breathe life back into these sites and bring industries back to these very areas.
How can we make this happen? How can we
do exactly what you're doing with this proposal, and that is incentivizing and carving out some of these programs, both technical assistance and financial, to incentivize readying these sites quicker in these rural areas so they can compete on a level playing field with the larger urban areas.
Do you think these communities have access to the necessary technical assistance to be able to utilize the program?
They do not, and that's where we strongly encourage the concurrence with the private sector. You remove the private sector out of that equation, and you rob these communities of a partner. There needs to be collaboration, there needs to be cooperation, and there needs to be involvement from the private sector.
Thank you. Commissioner Tincher, we understand that the Brownfields program is not the only federal program that communities have access to. Have you been able to leverage other federal incentives such as the Opportunity Zones Program, Historic Tax Credit, and New Market Tax Credits to complete brownfield projects?
Yes, the program that I spoke about, the redevelopment of the Rupert Elementary School in my county, we have been able to utilize the Brownfields program in order to begin that project. The total cost of that project is $3.6 million, and the construction cost, the project cost is $4.6 million. And we've utilized a low-income interest loan from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh, West Virginia historic tax credits, as well as federal historic tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, and deferred developer fees to be able to complete or to fund the entire project. Having the opportunities to utilize the Brownfield funding for leveraging other federal funds, state funds, and private funding is essential to counties and organizations in West Virginia to be able to get projects completed.
Right. Well, we toured a project like a hotel in my hometown of Augusta that benefited from the Opportunity Zones, and now that's a vibrant large hotel project on a site that is providing tremendous economic impact to our area. And as you know, during the Masters tournament, we need a lot of hotel rooms. And so that was very beneficial to our community. Listen, I want to thank all of you for being here. We need to look for cost-benefit programs and return on investment like this and where the federal government can assist. And I thank you for participating today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ford, I believe I once heard you refer to brownfields as job fields. So why do you believe more emphasis within EPA should be channeled to technical assistance and funding in order to move from brownfields to job fields?
The job fields that I refer to, if you look at all of the mega sites, the sites that are truly historically have been prepared for the Industrial Revolution, those areas right now have very little capacity. If you look at each one of, for example, the dozen sites that we're working on in rural areas, they probably have an economic development agency of 1 to maybe 2 people. So they don't have the capacity they barely have the capacity to apply for the money and administer the money. They need assistance with how to leverage the money, how to use the money for assessments, characterizations, planning, remediation. And this technical assistance program that has been available from the EPA has been instrumental not only with helping them understand how to apply for the grant and use the grant, but also how to collaborate with the private sector to maximize the leveraged investment to bring jobs to these sites.
Thank you. Commissioner Tincher, when Commissioner Largent from my home state of Washington testified 2 years ago, he called for greater and more meaningful consultation by EPA with counties under the Brownfields program. Would you agree with this concern?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you seen better consultation from EPA in recent years?
We have seen cooperation.
Okay. Could you provide me some examples of improved consultation between EPA and the counties?
Certainly. The EPA has hired additional coordinators in the Brownfields program for more engagement with those communities and counties that have limited capacity. It seems like some of these coordinators are having some learning curves, so we would urge to have the opportunity to make sure that we have those individuals are well-versed and provide information that is, by providing the information that's essential. We know that this, because there are limited capacity within the program, and being able to add more individuals, it does take time for education and information to be shared. But for the rural areas, this cooperation is very essential to us, and we are very appreciative of it.
Great. Thank you. I wonder, do you have any insights on the importance of separating out the IIJA funds and its one-time waivers from the circle of funding, the base funding, and if you want to speak to some of the matching requirements that were waived?
Unfortunately, I'm not able to speak very much on that. I'm very happy to get you some information related to some projects in our county and in West Virginia. There have been an increased number of projects in West Virginia for brownfields, and we have a lot happening, so I'm fairly certain I should be able to get some information for you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for those answers, and thank you all for being here. We appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and seeing no, okay, I will ramble for 30 seconds.
You can do that.
I could sing, but nobody would listen.
You're the chairman, we would have to listen.
Our witnesses will indulge for a second. Trahan, I think. The chair is now pleased, and I'll say this slowly so she can get seated, to recognize Ms. Trahan from Massachusetts for 5 minutes.
Chairman Johnson, thank you so much for letting me wave onto this hearing and to do so right at the tail end. I want to thank Ms. Melendez and the entire team at Groundwork Lawrence for the countless hours they have worked to redevelop brownfields in the city of Lawrence and support the people of the 3rd District in Massachusetts. There are hundreds of post-industrial brownfield sites in my district, many within underdeveloped and marginalized neighborhoods where they continue to pose a health risk and a barrier to development. It's thanks to the success of the Brownfields Development Program and the hard work of parts like the Dr. Nina Scarrito Park and the Manchester Street Park that they exist in Lawrence today. Ms. Melendez, you have to let me catch my breath. I just sprinted here, 3 floors. How does brownfield redevelopment promote environmental justice and equity for underserved communities like our city of Lawrence?
Thank you, Representative Trahan, and thank you for being here. One of the most important things that we talk about in terms of brownfields, in terms of equitable development, is community voice and youth voice and centering those voices at the very core of this work. And if it wasn't for centering those voices, we wouldn't be able to actually develop opportunities for jobs and opportunities for economic development and opportunities for increased public health. There are times where tough decisions have to be made because funding isn't always an open purse that we can get as much as we want, whenever we want. So sometimes some things have to get put on the back burner, but having transparency, having conversations, making sure that we're centering our folks at the very center of the work, at the core of who we are and what we do, is extremely important. And I think, back to my testimony when I said Brownfields project yield a triple bottom line of equity, health, and economic opportunities for all communities.
Which I get to see up close, firsthand. I also want to highlight the capacity of these projects to address many of the concerns that urban communities face today. Lawrence suffers from an urban heat island effect, which is only made worse as we experience more extreme heat events due to climate change. And during the COVID pandemic, parks and green spaces were some of the only places that people could safely interact with others and just get outdoors. Ms. Melendez, how have the green spaces built by Groundwork Lawrence helped the city deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change as a result?
It was one of the only places where people could go. In a community that is 6 square miles with over 80,000 residents, there wasn't a lot of space for people to use. And to be honest with you, we're not really welcome in spaces in some of the wealthier neighborhoods. They're not for people like us, that look like us. We get questioned, we get followed. So having our own spaces to be able to use was really important. One of the examples that I can think of and like to bring up is the use of our 12 community gardens in the city of Lawrence during the time of COVID, where the Board of Health of the city and the city's municipal government decided that they weren't going to allow us to open those gardens during COVID. And we had to fight, and we had to call on folks like yourself and others to help us have that fight. And the Board of Health decided that, yes, we could. But it took a lot of convincing, it took a lot of work to make sure that people had the opportunity to have these spaces.
You know, that's proof that our investments in brownfield revitalization do pay off for our districts and our communities. One last question. How has the EPA's brownfield program supported your work, and how will reauthorizing and funding it support Groundwork Lawrence's ongoing and future work?
The brownfield redevelopment, or the brownfield reauthorization this time is so important to us, and as many other times has been extremely important, but because of the funding, we are able to leverage additional dollars to be able to do this work. When we think about Dr. Nina Scarrito Park and the former private owner of the park, we were able to leverage the cleanup and assessment grant money from the Brownfields program to then have the former owner donate $1 million to be able to build the park. We didn't have money to build the park, but because we were able to leverage what we had gotten from the Brownfields funding, they were then invested in making sure that we were able to build this park. And we also used a technique called a covenant not to sue. And I will provide more information to the committee in writing about it, but that was the one way that we were able to get support from private industry to be able to do this project and to be able to move projects like this forward.
Great. Thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and seeing no further members seeking to ask questions, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. I remind all members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to those questions promptly. Again, thank you to our panelists today. This has been very informative. Thank you very much. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.